moderate, and I don't use that in a politically loaded sense, to moderate its policies in the light of the lack of a vote of confidence in either major party?
But you see, the trouble is, political parties can't do that. The Labour Party, if it threw overboard, for instance, the repeal of the Industrial Relations Act, would so infuriate its own members in Parliament and out of it that it would simply lose the following election.
That wasn't the sort of thing I had in mind, really. I mean, they could say they could do that, and that might not perhaps precipitate a crime. I'm talking about immediate economic measures to...
Well, even immediate economic measures, you know, are matters of party controversy. For instance, the Labour Party might wish to increase direct taxation, which the Conservative Party has always opposed.
Right, OK. Well, if they have a round-table conference at Buckingham Palace like they had in 1931, perhaps the Queen will have as much difficulty as I'm having in trying to promote a national coalition. Interrogatively, that is only. Alistair?
Robin. Yes, there's one point there that Robin didn't pick up in that discussion, and that is that the Queen need not ask the advice of Mr. Heath constitutionally. She may ask for it for the retiring Prime Minister. If he is the retiring Prime Minister, he could refuse to or decline to give it if he chose to. It's open to the Queen either to ask the retiring Prime Minister for advice or not to ask it, and secondly, if asked, with respect, a retiring Prime Minister can decline to give advice. Therefore, it's an open question and quite constitutional either way.
And that, of course, makes it even perhaps less clear to many people just precisely who is going to be in charge of the country in the coming few days. Well, David, we've heard a very interesting point there, I think, from Brian Walden, a suggestion that the Labour Party might refuse to do anything and Mr. Heath would continue perhaps as a caretaker until another general election is called.
Well, we're getting into a rather dangerously speculative area here, which goes into the psychology of the individuals in what is essentially an unfamiliar situation. The British Constitution is supposed to work by precedent, and we naturally bring in what happened in 1923 and 1929 and 1931, and people will talk a bit about this. But I think they'll make the rules up afresh in this present situation. They will try and play fair. There will be a great public demand for them to play fair, and obviously people are going to have to make big sacrifices in national compromise.
But now, what do you mean by playing fair?
Well, not seeming to make party points and to stick on particular things that they've said in the past, because they just can't all have their own way. You've got to give up an awful lot of what you've said. It may make people have no faith in politicians, but you've just got to get decisions made in the next month and a half.
This is particularly true, I suppose, in the question of personalities. Mr. Thorpe was saying that he wouldn't serve under Mr. Wilson or Mr. Heath, but he liked some of the lesser range of people.
The breakfast thing, when you were in bed, we had Lord Beaumont telling us that he didn't think that was quite, or Saul Smith it was, saying he didn't think that was quite what Jeremy Thorpe had said.
Mr. Smith and Mr. Thorpe sometimes don't actually see eye to eye, even on what each other said. Well, now, we've been speculating here in London, but Michael Charlton, who was up in Liverpool at the Count at Huyton, has, of course, been soldiering on through the watches of the night, close to Mr. Wilson, and I wonder what the news is from there. I think we might have a word with Michael on the phone. Good morning, Michael. Hello? He doesn't seem to be there. I'm accused of having gone to bed. I don't blame him if he's still getting out of bed, but I think he's been up there working hard this morning, and we'll have a word with him about what the mood and the atmosphere and some of the ideas around Mr. Wilson in Liverpool right now, before Mr. Wilson returns to London. Good, so there we have the position. Mr. Wilson, of course, David, is in rather an unusual point here. It must be a matter of pride to a Prime Minister who has lost office to get back into 10 Downing Street.
I think it must be a matter of enormous pride, and when quite a lot of people in the press and elsewhere were writing him off and discussing who would be the new leader of the Labour Party after Mr. Wilson's due defeat, he must be feeling very good indeed, though not nearly as good as if he'd got another 15 seats.
Well, now we have the news that the Financial Times index at 10 o'clock was down 25.5 points this morning. That's the markdown which we've heard about. And in our studio at Broadcasting House, the BBC economics correspondent, Dominic Harrod. And now, how do you read the situation this morning?
Well, I think one of the first things one's got to say about this markdown of the Financial Times index, this 25-point loss, is really that the city appears to have believed totally in a Conservative victory at this election during the campaign, and the Financial Times index was up just about 25 points during the course of the campaign. So this morning's markdown, and it was a markdown, I think, in fact, at the opening at 9:30, half an hour before the figure we've got, probably shares were even lower than that. simply because when the dealers came onto the floor in the morning, they came right down to the bottom, and they marked down all their sheets of paper, and in fact there's been a little buying. ICI, for instance, was at 232 pence yesterday. It was as low as 203, nearly 30 pence off, but now business is being done at about 214, so you see there's a bit of buying coming in. But evidently it was this feeling reflected in the index for the last few weeks that the Conservatives were going to get in. This has been to some extent shattered this morning, and I think, of course, what the city really hates is uncertainty, and uncertainty is what we've got a basin full of at the moment.
And that, of course, is a problem for the pound. It had gone up a little bit, as I was saying earlier, because during the election, I think people thought that the Conservatives were coming back, and at least the Conservatives are often favoured by foreign opinion in these matters. It's come down again this morning. What reactions are you getting?
Well, again, I've been talking to people in the city this morning, and it looks to me as though we are being a bit more gloomy about our prospects than foreigners are. The pound was at about $2.30½ last night, before anything became apparent. It dropped 3 cents, 3.5 cents in early dealings this morning, and then recovered 1.25 cents. So there again, and it's frightfully early days to start talking about what the foreign reaction or what the stock market reaction is, because you get very wide movements on a day, particularly like today, when one doesn't know anything for certain. As I said before, the city hates uncertainty.
Well, there's the position from the city, Dominic Harrod. Of course, in the old phrase, what one wants is something to see the country just over the weekend. Well, David.
Well, I just was doing one quick little calculation, in fact. The last election in Great Britain, not leaving out Ireland, there was a 2.4% Conservative lead over Labour. So far, on the results we've had so far, the Conservatives have dropped by 2.2% more than the Labour Party, which does project one to a position where, if the same pattern follows in today's results, we would have the Conservatives 0.2% ahead in the vote in England and Wales and Scotland. And then if you add in Northern Ireland, where there were no Labour, or only one Labour Party candidate, Northern Ireland Labour, which isn't quite the same, you might actually argue that the Conservatives will be, you know, nearly 0.5% ahead, perhaps, in votes, though behind in seats.
Now, it very much comes down, then, in the hours this morning and this afternoon to performance in those individual seats which Labour has got to take. Now, once upon a time, I think you were of the mind that personal performance by a candidate or good organisation and so on was worth about 500 votes.
No,
now,
I never said that. I never said that. It was a Labour agent who said it, and I once quoted it. As a veteran Labour agent said, and whenever I meet an MP, he said, "Ah, you're the chap who says I'm not worth 500 votes." No, there have been some splendid personal triumphs that you could cite of people bucking the tide, of Conservatives who haven't gone down, the swing, Nelson and Coe, David Waddington, Mr. Money, who improved his position in marginal Ipswich, and Geoffrey Finsberg in marginal Hampstead, Sally Oppenheim in Gloucester, and Nick Edwards in Pembroke. That's one of the most remarkable results, the Conservatives holding on to Pembroke, where there wasn't a Donnelly dividing the vote this time, Mr. Loveridge in Upminster, Mr. Roberts in Conway. There really are quite a lot of things where it may have been other local circumstances or local issues, or local reactions to national issues, but there are some members who are going to be feeling rather good about their results.
Well, rather good, but they're all very marginal still. A chap sitting in a marginal seat, what's his position in such a government? I mean, in days when governments are really doing very badly indeed in the polls and by-elections, the most marginal people sometimes take the toughest view because they say, well, I know I'll be out anyway.
Nobody will know they'll be out at the beginning of this, in this Parliament, because it'll be such an uncertain position, whether the Parliament's going to last a week, a month or a year, will be there. I don't think people like having elections. They're expensive and exhausting, and there will be quite a lot of pressure of people not to have elections, whether they're in a safe seat or a marginal seat.
Well, we can't offer very much comfort to MPs. We can, of course, say to some prospective ministers that they may get back into the limousine, and we can say to others that you're out of the ministerial limousine. So that's something to think about. There have, of course, been complaints in the past that elections have been called before ministers could go off on holiday with their wives and came back to rather impoverished circumstances. But Bob is standing with the battleground, and he's got some words to say about it.
Well, just picking up one of David's points about MPs and local organisations sometimes be able to buck the tide, you'll see it has happened at a few occasions. In other words, although there's been a swing to Labour, Conservatives have picked up 2 seats on this side, which are marginal Labour seats. And when you look the other way and look at the 2% swing to Labour and the seats that were then vulnerable among the marginally held Conservative seats on this side, you'll see that quite often the Conservatives have bucked the tide, as it were, and Labour nonetheless has been carrying a majority. The red X's represent the ones Labour has carried. But it's quite striking that the Conservative tide wasn't uniformly rolled back the way it was in many other elections. This is partly because, of course, we had to guess about the effect of redistribution in some cases. Nonetheless, it does, I think, bring out the point that there was a good deal more shifting back and forth against the tide than we would expect in most recent general elections. One further point again, just to remind us, the Liberal failure to take off has been the most dramatic and saddening thing from their point of view, since they were at one stage looked as if they might get into that takeoff position and just failed to do so. As it is, they're highly underrepresented for their percentage of the votes cast, around 18%, and yet only a handful of seats.
Now, David, just a point on that. What have the Liberals got to hope for today, particularly?
They've got quite a number of seats where they have very important hopes. And there are 5 seats they want to hold. There's North Cornwall, that's John Pardo, Montgomery, Orkney and Shetland, Inverness and Roxburgh. These are all seats that are vulnerable, where they have sitting MPs who must hope to get back. And Ely and Berwick and Ripon, too. There's by-election victories that they hope for. Then, if they're to make gains, there's Bodmin and Tiverton and West Aberdeen and Colne Valley. I think that's probably one of the best prospects, and that would be at Labour's expense, and Ross and Cromarty. And then there are a number more further down the list, and 1 or 2 of them might be picked up, but I don't think they're very likely on tonight's form. Caithness is another just possible Liberal gain.
And of course, some of these are from very distant seats, which we won't be hearing from until really very late indeed in the day, Ross and Cromarty in particular. Well, we are hoping to hear from Northern Ireland, where of course there was no counting last night. We expect to be getting some results coming in midday and onwards, but just to check about that, let's hear the situation in Belfast from Vincent Hanna.
Well, Belfast has woken up to a morning of sleet and rain, with the centre of the city still littered with the debris of last night's terror, because general elections Ulster style include 12 bombs exploding in the city centre, 1 man dead, a lady who has lost both her legs, and several shooting incidents at polling stations and at returning officers. Well, there'd be a temptation in normal times to regard the election in Northern Ireland, this part of it, as being a slightly eccentric and relatively unimportant diversion. But of course, this is not a normal general election. The knife-edge situation in Britain may mean that whatever party assumes power, they're going to need the votes of 12 members of Parliament coming from Belfast to Westminster. And the stark fact is that at least 6 of those members of Parliament, when they get there, may well be committed to disrupting the traditional democratic process in Westminster. Because this election is not about prices or industrial relations or about the common market in Northern Ireland. It's about the border, the political future of Northern Ireland, and the package worked out by the last government, supported by the Labour Party, about power sharing and the future of the political process in Ulster. We're going to try and assess the situation and see what the prospects are during the day. Remember, the first counts will start about 12:30 to 1 o'clock, because we don't count in the dark in Northern Ireland. With me is Dr. Con O'Leary from Queen's University Belfast, who's our resident political expert here. Can you tell us what is the situation? Are there any guidelines we can use to assess it?
Well, the Westminster results of 1970 are of very little use, because since then the party system here has been completely transformed. The most important single change being that until 1973, a single party, the Conservatives, later the Unionists, dominated Ulster results, not just since 1921, when Northern Ireland was set up, but since 1832. And now they're split into 4 factions forming 2 main groups, the pro-Assembly Unionists and the Loyalist Coalition.
So as we look at the results coming through, what is the sort of swing position? Who are the main contenders?
The main contenders will be the Loyalist Coalition and the parties supporting the executive, the pro-Faulkner Unionists, the Alliance and the SDLP. If we want some measure of swing, such as has been used across the water, I would suggest that we take the aggregate figures cast for the Loyalist Coalition in all these constituencies in the Assembly election of 1973, because the constituencies were the same, even though they were fought under PR, and the Loyalist Coalition are now contesting the same seats.
So if we do those sums and we add them all up, where does it get us today? I mean, what do you think the prospects are?
Well, I think taking the last results and making some allowances for personalities, that the pro-assembly unionists should get at least 3 seats, all in Belfast, Belfast East, North and South. The Loyalists should get 5, Antrim North, Mr Paisley's seat, Antrim South, Armagh, Derry and Down South. The remaining 4 are a toss-up. And those, incidentally, are the seats where Mr Gerry Fitt, the SDLP leader, Mrs McAliskey, and Mr Frank McManus are contesting.
So it's very much a knife-edge situation here as well.
Very much indeed.
And if the Loyalists get in, or the extreme nationalist candidates like Bernadette Devlin and Frank McManus get in, they are committed, of course, to totally opposing any kind of power sharing, any kind of assembly, and any kind of democratic order here.
They're certainly opposed to the Sunningdale Agreement for various reasons. And if, for example, the Loyalists were to get not just the 5 that I suggest, but the other 4 as well, 9, for example, they would immediately attempt to renegotiate the Council of Ireland, which isn't yet ratified.
Well, a little forecasting there from Northern Ireland, where elections themselves have become something of an industry, and more problems for the incoming government here. Our computer is a little underemployed, but Robin Day is in full employment.
And with me is Mr. Helmut Zorger, London correspondent of Der Spiegel, the German magazine. Mr. Zorger, you, of course, come from a country which has a Labour or Social Democrat Prime Minister, the Federal Chancellor, in a coalition with Liberals, in a loose phrase, the Free Democrats.
Yes.
Are you therefore surprised at our British inhibition, certainly from from the 2 major parties, about forming a coalition government with a minority party?
I think it has worked quite well. I mean, on internal German policies, it doesn't work all the time, on taxation, for example, on various other issues which Germany inside are concerned. If you talk about foreign policy, there is not at all any problem. There's a complete agreement within the coalition. But I have to say also that the Liberal Party in Germany has about 8.4% of the vote in Germany, 41 parliamentarians in our parliament, and they have 5 ministers.
Yeah, well, our Liberals have got about 18%, and they will only get perhaps about 13 seats, according to our computer projection. But let me put this to you. Isn't there a difference, though, in Germany, and a very fundamental one, that Chancellor Brandt, though he's a democratic socialist, is not as left-wing a socialist as in his policy as the British Labour Party, and also there isn't that difference between him and the Christian Democrats. Indeed, he was in a coalition with the Christian Democrats for a bit.
He was in the coalition with the Christian Democrats from 66 to 69 because they wanted to become governable. They had the same problems as the Labour Party had here. Nobody thought they could govern, and they went into this coalition not only because they felt Germany was in danger, but they felt they needed to get into government in order to be accepted as government.
What chance do you think has a minority British Labour government of pursuing its renegotiation policy on the common market with its European partners?
I think they have a very, very difficult position. First of all, I agree with Mr. Scheel, who said those EEC contracts are not contracts with one party or the other, it's a contract with governments. So if they come into the EEC or they try to negotiate in the EEC, they'll face, obviously, very, very many problems. Mr. Wilson has been very nice with Mr. Pompidou. His statements about him as an opposition leader were not very diplomatic. Mr. Brandt and Mr. Wilson have problems, apparently, because Mr. Brandt doesn't like what Mr. Wilson is saying about the common market.
Well, perhaps we could discuss the Labour policy on the common market for renegotiation and so on of the terms a little later with you, if we have a moment, because they're very interesting. Alistair?
Indeed, very interesting. Grand coalition has been spoken about in Britain, but we haven't made much progress. Not even Robin's made much progress in reaching one in this country this morning. But there's still plenty of time. And I was trying to get hold of Michael Charlton in Liverpool on the phone a short while ago. I understand that he's here with us not just on the phone, but actually in vision. Good morning, Michael.
What? Mr. Wilson left here, the Adelphi Hotel, left this table about 10 minutes ago on his way back to London with a full motorcycle escort and police cars, the sign of a man who may be on the brink of office as Prime Minister. He made a very short statement here before he left and answered one or two questions. He spent the night, incidentally, at Kirby, in part of his old electorate, about 11 miles from here, and arrived back here for breakfast and left almost immediately afterwards. But the most important points of his statements were these, that he was returning now to London to consult his parliamentary colleagues, the shadow cabinet. He'll be doing that about 2:30. He's first of all going to his home in Lord North Street. From here, when he gets back to London, he's flying back there. He may call in a transport house, but the most important and immediate future fixture that he has to meet is this meeting with the shadow cabinet, the Labour shadow cabinet, at 2:30 this afternoon. Now, in his statement, Mr. Wilson said that it was imperative that a government must be quickly formed to deal with the pressing economic problems the country faces at home and abroad. Now, we had the chance of putting one or two questions to him about this, and I asked him for the BBC about this question of a minority government, and he said the answer he would give this morning is what he said to us in the BBC interview last night, that a minority government would not be the happiest thing, that no one really enjoyed the prospect, but that there might be no alternative. And so Mr. Wilson is on his way here. We asked him one more thing about the historical precedents for this deadlock situation that the country finds itself in, or apparently is going to find itself in, if all these predictions on the computers and analyses hold up. The situations in 1923 and 1929. And Mr. Wilson said enigmatically, and refused to expand on it, that he'd been listening to the pundits. Doubtless he's been watching all the television screens this morning, and he thinks that they're all wrong. He sees no precedent in today's situation with those. But as I say, an enigmatic answer. He just thinks that they're wrong and refuses to expand on that. Mr. Wilson, on his way back to London, and from the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, back to the studio.
And David, Mr. Wilson saying, Michael telling us that Mr. Wilson was saying that these precedents of the 20s are wrong. Presumably he has in mind the nationalist upsurge this time and the serious situation in Northern Ireland, quite apart from any political results which come from there.
And also, I do think that precedents mustn't be preserved too long. A lot of British government has been confused by people citing Victorian precedents simply because the situation hasn't arisen for 80 years. You do have to make your rules again. You remember what Austin Chamberlain said, unconstitutional is a term used in politics when the other fellow does something you don't like. And this essentially is what we shall have as an argument. I mean, it's a great problem. Mr. Wilson says he wants to conciliate, wants to unite the nation. Well, he will have to give up some things in order to unite the nation and get the sort of support he wants in Parliament and get the public to feel that he isn't playing party games at this sort of stage. But how it will work out, we shall have to see. I certainly don't feel I can forecast the future by just extrapolating from the past, as to some extent I do with the computer and election results.
But Mr. Wilson was making the point that the new government needs to be quickly formed, and seeing his colleagues at 2:30 this afternoon. So it does seem that he's very well apprised of the general economic situation, and he isn't quite as relaxed about it as perhaps some of the people who've been speaking earlier this morning.
I'm sure this is true. I'm sure that things will move fairly fast.
And, of course, that depends perhaps upon what Mr. Wilson can get from other party leaders, but it also depends upon these very vital results, which, of course, are going to be coming in lunchtime and afterwards, and, of course, on through the afternoon, which will finally decide where the balance of power does lie between all the parties, and also show just how these small parties, the nationalists, are going to influence the Westminster Parliament.
We really should be getting results fairly soon, because they usually start counting at 9. They've got all the ballot boxes there. On the night, we get the result a little over an hour from the start. Now, there are no races, but by 2 hours after the start on the night, we're really getting quite a lot of results, and people who aren't trying special races to it. So I think any moment now we shall get a few results up.
Well, there's no kudos, of course, for being a town clerk in being first on the second day, but we might actually have to put in a little handicap race for them next year and make him the town clerk of the counties, or county clerk of the counties. The local authorities, of course, have been saying that they're terribly overworked anyway because of all the changes in local government. One doesn't know whether the banks are on 3-day weeks because there might be some bank clerks available for counting the ballots. There may be some special circumstances, but we'll wait and we'll hope that somebody will be reporting fairly soon. Have a little look now at how the regions have gone in the election so far. These, of course, are last night's results. There's the swing to Labour in Greater London, but, of course, the Liberals picking up most of the increase in the vote. Their share of the vote gone up 14%, but no seat. Here's the home counties. Again, Labour doing very well and very much better than the last opinion polls about the home counties suggested. I don't think that the last opinion polls there can be defended. The Liberals showing up very strongly, but again, not being rewarded in seats. And in East Anglia, this is one of the places where we're expecting to hear rather prominently from this morning and this afternoon. A little swing to Labour there. Again, Liberals doing best, but so far, of course, no seats. There's, of course, Clement Freud will be very interested there in Ely. And here we have the situation in the south. Liberals running very strongly indeed, small swing to Labour. And as I say, Clement Freud there waiting in East Anglia to know his result. Mr. Alan Beath in Berwick-on-Tweed. And, of course, Mr. Orstick in Ripon. These three by-election victors wondering perhaps whether they are going to go the same way as Mr. Graham Tope in Sutton and Cheam. Remember, the Conservatives took that back last night.
Or the same way as Cyril Smith in Rochdale, who held his seat.
And I wonder if we have the situation now that gives Mr. Wilson the outriders and this most important plane journey back to London, the Labour gains so far. And, of course, this is a list that Mr. Wilson wants to add to. Some of those places that he lost last time and made difficulty for him. Keighley, for example, Bolton East, the Conservatives picked up last time. Plymouth Devonport, there's a Labour gain against a sitting Conservative member, although, of course, the seat was greatly changed. And there are others besides. This is the Labour Roll of Honour, which Mr. Wilson presumably perhaps can recite. He has a very good memory indeed. And here are some others. Some of the very swing seats which take place. That isn't quite the right spelling all the way. We're sorry about that. And note how Preston South has gone, Gravesend. These are indicator seats. The new seat there in Kingswood, just to the east of Bristol. And Birmingham, of course, showing up prominently, as Labour has done so well in the Midlands. And here, Norwich South, well, that may be a little pointer to Labour doing well in East Anglia. And Derby North, good personal success there for Philip Whitehead. Preston North, Lanark, personal success there for Judith Hart. And just two more there, Middleton and Prestwich and Aldridge, Brown Hills, Dame Pat Hornsby-Smith failing to hold that for the Conservatives. Well, Mr. Wilson wants to see that list lengthened today. If it does, he will be in a much stronger position in order to claim the reins of power and indeed to be an effective Prime Minister. But if, as David was saying earlier on, if Labour doesn't make the sort of progress of that nature, then we could have a much more even-Steven situation, and who knows where that might end. Now, we have dismissed the grand coalition idea, David. At least the politicians have said they don't work that way. If it were a prolonged crisis, supposing it went on through the beginning of next week, and supposing there were economic pressures on the country, surely this would still be an option.
I think it is an option. I think one would be very foolish to dismiss any possibility. They might make a grand coalition for a quite finite period, a given number of weeks or months. We will not raise these issues till these decisions have been made. This much we can agree on as necessary for the next few weeks. And let's not raise the issue of playing politics while these things are done to get the country going again.
Well, some people would say that might indeed be the best solution if the economic winds blow and the snow falls and the pound is in serious trouble. Now, Bob Mackenzie.
Well, after this very moment, the debate is raging at this question of minority government, possible coalition and so on. One sometimes forgets that it's been tried before, and the whole debate began in the 1920s, in the interwar years. In November 1923, Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative Prime Minister, called a general election specifically to get a mandate for his new policy of protective tariffs. Both the Liberals under Asquith and the Labour Party under Ramsay MacDonald campaigned for free trade. The result was indecisive. The Tories did best with 258 seats, but when Baldwin met Parliament, he was outvoted by the Labour Party with 191 and the Liberals with 158. Within a week, Ramsay MacDonald, although he led the second largest party, was in number 10 at the head of the first Labour government. He made no policy agreement with Asquith's Liberals and was constantly at the mercy of the Liberal vote. In October 1924, MacDonald, defeated in the House, was on his way back to the palace to tender his resignation. His government had not been a success, and Baldwin returned with a massive majority, helped by the Red Scare roused over the forged Zinoviev letter. 5 years later, in the general election of 1929, the two major parties reversed their positions. Labour now had 287 seats to the Tories' 261. But again, the Liberals, led now by Lloyd George, held the balance. Ramsay MacDonald went to Windsor to kiss hands triumphantly enough. But the cabinet he introduced to the press in the garden of Number 10 were to face 2 more frustrating years trying to govern without a clear majority. Again, no attempt at alliance with the Liberals was made by Ramsay MacDonald. In 1931, the great financial crisis produced MacDonald's resignation. But he was soon back at Buckingham Palace to kiss hands as leader of the Conservative-dominated national government. Only the rump of his own party under Arthur Henderson opposed the national coalition. They were massively defeated, and Labour did not win another election for 14 years. I think there are some parallels and some differences in those situations. I was looking at the figures, actually. You take Labour in 1923, coming to office as a minority government, had only 30% of the vote behind it, astonishingly small proportion. And in 1929, 37%, rather more like the position we might have now, and they've got 39%, although they're likely to have substantially more seats, well, rather more seats than they had in 1929. And you'll see there the comparative figures, that very small Labour proportion in 1923 and the considerably larger proportion, rather like the present proportion of 37%, probably they'll have 39 this time, and 288 seats, where they're likely to have now about 310 or even more than that. So there are parallels and interesting things about it. But I think it's deep in the soul of the Labour Party, having had that experience, they must not get trapped into minority government for very long at least, and therefore I'd expect them to go much sooner to the country.
Well, of course, Mr. Wilson says he doesn't consider the 20s a precedent. He was saying that to Michael Charlton earlier this morning, and I suppose the very name Ramsay MacDonald is one that makes people step back.
I think probably he would try to play it more like 64, when he didn't have really a working majority, and look for the first opportunity to turn back to the country and say, now, we want a working majority, and he got it. That took about a year and a half to do, of course, but that kind of precedent might be the one that he thinks is more relevant than 23 or 29.
Well, now, Robin is talking to somebody who would know the Ramsay MacDonald precedent as well as anybody, Manny Shinwell.
Lord Shinwell, you were a member of the 1929 government, which we heard about during that interesting historical film that Robert Mackenzie was commenting on. Let me ask you this. To what extent do you think Harold Wilson, if he's a minority Labour Prime Minister, should take into account public opinion in this poll, judging by the results so far, and perhaps moderate his policies?
Well, even if he's got an overall majority, he must have regard to public opinion. If he's in a minority position but takes charge, becomes Prime Minister in a minority government, he can't brush aside the Liberal the votes of around about 5 million. Public opinion must be considered. For example, in the 1929 government, in 1920 it was different because Baldwin had the largest single party. He didn't want to continue. The King sent for Ramsay MacDonald and he formed a minority government which only lasted 11 months.
But in 1929?
In 1929 we had the largest single party, the Labour Party, the largest single party. And MacDonald formed a government. Now, the Liberals had about 59 or 60 members in the House of Commons at the time. If there had not been mutual aversion and dislike between Ramsay MacDonald and Lloyd George, it would have changed the whole course of our political and social history.
What you're saying is that if a minority Labour government had joined forces with the Liberal minority, perhaps the recession of the 30s could have been avoided?
It didn't require a coalition. But there was some affinity there as regards the social services, pensions, unemployment, housing, and as regards Lloyd George, he wanted taxation of land values, and was even prepared to nationalise land. We could have cooperated, and as a result, we could have avoided all the unemployment that subsequently occurred, and not only that, we might have avoided that terrible financial recession in 1931.
Now, as a veteran of three pre-war Labour governments, and as a former chairman of the Labour Party until quite recently, Lord Shinwell, what is your advice to Harold Wilson today?
If he forms a minority government, it's impossible to implement every item in the Labour Party manifesto. You can't do that. First of all, he's got to seek means of promoting economic recovery. Get the people back to work. He's got to try and boost exports. He's got to try and deal with the problem of the balance of payments. All this thing has got to be done, and he can't do it all by himself. He must have support in the House of Commons. Where's he going to get it from?
What about his renegotiation policy of the common market? Now, I know you always say to hell with the common market, but the Liberals wouldn't support him if he says to hell with the common market.
No, I don't say to hell with the common market.
You've said that. I've heard you say that at Labour Party conferences.
All I've said is this, that I thought from the beginning, I've never changed my mind, I'm unrepentant, that I think the economic community is bound to disrupt. But never mind about that, that's a prediction. What I do say is to talk about renegotiation. Well, it's very difficult to what we're going to renegotiate about, perhaps the common agricultural policy. That means trouble with the French.
Well, now, Lord Shimwell, we've got in The Hague, in Holland, one of the men who signed the Treaty of Rome when it was made many years ago, a former president of the Common Market Commission, and a man who is now critical of the common market in many ways, Dr. Sicko Mansholt. Good morning, Dr. Mansholt.
Good morning.
You remember we met in Oxford recently?
We did, yes.
And what do you think about the Labour Party's plans for renegotiating the terms of entry, in particular major changes in the common agricultural policy, new methods of financing the community budget, retention by the British Parliament of powers over the British economy, and cheaper food from low-cost producers outside Europe for the British market, and so on?
Well, that's quite a program that you are mentioning there.
Well, that's what they mentioned in their manifesto.
I understand, yes.
Yes.
Well, as far as changing the policy of the common market, it's quite clear that every country has the right to make proposals to do so, but he has to convince the others.
Yes.
So, in my opinion, the common market policy should be dynamic. It should not be static. When it is wrong, you should alter it, you should improve it. And there's a lot to improve. I several times have said that in meetings in your country, that as far as social policy, you can develop a real social policy that's real, directed to the interests of the workers, and that should be done. Up to now, we failed to do so, and I very much hope that, for instance, when Labour comes in government, that they will be one of the great promoters of a good social policy in the common market. Secondly, we badly need democracy.
Now, Dr.
Yes?
Mansholt, are you saying this, that if a minority Labour government comes in and seeks to make changes in the common market on the lines that I have mentioned, quoting from their manifesto, are you saying that these are all things which can go on the table and be discussed? Are you saying they haven't got a hope of getting them through, or what?
No, well, that's not up to me to say what the hope is, of course. It all depends on the concrete and the specific proposal you're making. But every policy can be changed in the common market. And every country, United Kingdom or Ireland or Denmark or Holland, everyone has a right to make proposals and to discuss them. But what I say is you have to convince the others, because these decisions have to be taken in unanimity. It are major decisions, changing agriculture policy fundamentally, and there should something be changed in agriculture policy.
Hold
we all
on.
know that.
Hold on, Dr. Mansholt. I want to bring in again Mr. Helmut Jorge of Der Spiegel, who is in our London studio, and he's been listening with interest to you. Do you think that what Dr. Mansholt is saying means that there is quite a wide scope for negotiation towards some of the things which the Labour Party wants?
I think I wouldn't call it negotiations, I would call it readjustments. If you go and you find that something doesn't work, then you have to readjust it. But to say if you are not negotiating with us, then we move out.
But you, as a London correspondent, you know as well as I do that some of the Labour ministers are more interested in getting out than in renegotiation.
Yes, but I think they have a serious problem now. If you look at the voting, as it has been, the Liberals, who are pro-European, and the Conservatives, who have been pro-European, have actually the majority of votes as it looks at the moment. So it means that possibly the majority of the English people don't want to get out. Now, if the party follows their line of bringing a referendum to the people, and the people are voting for Europe, the left wing of the party will have great problems.
Dr. Mansell, what is your comment on that, and in particular that it's more a question of readjustment than renegotiation?
That's quite right. When I am saying you can always change the policy, that does not mean that you have to change the treaty, but because a treaty gives you great lines on it's the base for a policy, but you can decide every agriculture policy on that base.
Could you just answer me one question before I ask a leading Labour newly elected MP to comment? Do you think that the terms of entry of Britain contained in the Treaty of Accession of last year can be renegotiated as opposed to the readjustment process, the dynamic process which goes on all the time?
No, it has not to be renegotiated, the treaty of adherence. You can adjust it. You can adjust it. You can make another policy. Even you can change, let's say, agriculture policy fundamentally. When you don't want to have high prices, you want to have low prices, you can work with subsidies.
Yes.
You can apply a total other system of income policy in agriculture, and that is the main difficulty.
Hold on, Dr. Mansell. I want to bring in Brian Walden, who is a Labour front bench spokesman in the last Parliament and who was a frequent visitor to Strasbourg in the days when he was slightly more enthusiastic about the common market than he is now. Brian, what do you say to what Dr. Sicko Mansell has been saying?
Well, our problem is a simple one, really. The Labour Party is not only pledged to renegotiate, it's pledged...
Renegotiate what?
The terms on which the Conservative government took us in.
The Treaty of Accession?
Well, yes, of course. And if you're going to call it adjustment, well, I'm not going to quarrel about words. But the real problem is this. Whatever happens in that renegotiation, we're then committed to hold either a referendum or a general election on that issue.
Well, you may have a general election sooner than you think.
Well, yeah, but that's the problem, you see. The general election, I suspect, if it happened in 6 months' time, wouldn't be about the common market at all. It would be about quite different things.
But do you really think that the various proposals listed in the manifesto for renegotiating the common market are in fact renegotiations, or are they proposals which will ensure that we will have to withdraw?
I think the possibility of withdrawal will be there. There's no question about it.
Breaking the treaty?
Breaking the treaty is a very hard word.
Well, what is the other word you would use?
Letting the British people decide this issue. I think when they do, they'll vote to come out. I think one has to face that. The British do not wish to belong to the European common market.
Thank you, Brian Walden. One brief comment on that, Dr. Mansell?
Yes, in my opinion, that would be the wrong way to handle the whole thing. In my opinion, that is not any question of going out of the common market. It would even not be in the real interest of the United Kingdom. But what I can fully understand is that the Labour Party doesn't agree with, let's say, agriculture policy, and so they can urge for changing that policy. That's fully the right to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Mansell, for joining us. Perhaps we may have another comment from you. Thank you, Brian Walden. And now, Alistair.
And our computer is back in business. During that conversation, you would notice the first result of the day, City of London and Westminster South, held by the Conservatives. That's Mr. Christopher Tugendhat there, holding that seat. And there is the full result.
Only 54% voted there, and there was a drop of 0.3 compared to last time. I think it's the first time I've spotted a fall in turnout in the whole of the 440 results we've had. Slight swing to the Labour Party there. And Mr. Boakes loses his deposit. He stood in 3 seats and has lost his deposit in all of them.
The other two being Streatham and Wimbledon. We also noticed, of course, that there's a recount going on in Bodmin, down in the West Country. There's a Liberal hope there. And also we are hoping to get some results soon from Carlton, from Cirencester, and from one of the Derbyshire seats. If it's southeast, that could be an important one. It's been readjusted by the boundary commissioners, but the Conservatives took it last time. It could be marginal for them. Well, now David Dimbleby is down where the action is going to get more and more important as the day goes on, at 10 Downing Street. David.
The comings and goings in Downing Street have been limited this morning to the world's press and a crowd growing on the other pavement. The Chancellor, Mr. Anthony Barber, just returned to number 11. The Prime Minister is anticipating staying here in Downing Street probably until well after lunch. He last night spoke to Lord Carrington, who came here when Mr. Heath came from Sidcup, and with Lord Allen, who's been helping run the campaign. He went to bed at about 3 o'clock. He got up at the normal time, about 8:30 this morning, since when I gather he's been in touch with senior colleagues. They've not visited here yet. They may later on. The view at the moment is a firm no comment, that it certainly doesn't look as though either party is going to have a majority, that there is still a possibility that the Tories may be the biggest party, and that the difficulty is that the Liberal vote is so unpredictable they can't tell which way it'll go. Comparisons are being made with the situation in 1964 with Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, when they had to sweat it out right through Friday, and when the East Anglian results nearly swung it back to the Tories. The only unease, perhaps, being felt is that at this moment government has virtually come to a halt. I gather that it's thought it would be improper for Mr. Heath now to take any decisions until the political situation had been made more clear, and that there may perhaps inside Downing Street be some apprehension about international developments during the day, and that clearly the priority is to get this political situation sorted out as quickly as possible so that the Queen's government can continue. But in any case, the Prime Minister is expected to stay here until well into the afternoon, until the results are perfectly clear. David Dimbleby in Downing Street.
And of course, we'll notice there, while David was talking, that the Paddington result is in. This was one with 2 sitting members at the merged seat, and Mr. Arthur Latham has held that for Labour. One would have expected that with the swing which has been going on. Mr. Nicholas Scott, one of the more promising of the Conservative junior ministers, losing the seat, and so he won't even expect to be in a minority government at the present situation. Well, now we, of course, saw the Queen arriving at Heathrow earlier on today. And there is the scene now. Mr. Wilson is flying back from Liverpool. Perhaps it's the Queen's next First Minister who's going to be arriving there. And of course, Mr. Wilson has said that he's going to have a meeting with his colleagues, his senior colleagues, at 2:30 this afternoon. And here we have another result from Reigate this time. This is one where the Conservatives have held on. It's one of their strongholds.
And the Liberals in second place. This is just like the seats we got at the beginning last night, which raised Liberal hopes when the first 5 Conservative seats all got the Liberals jumping up into second place. Reigate's like that, but still comfortably Conservative.
Well, the important ones, of course, will be coming along now, almost any time now. As I said, we're hoping from some declarations. Carlton and Derbyshire, Cirencester, all these are in a minor race today for the places on the second day. But these seats are, of course, going to be most important. Well, David, from the first prognostications, the first results we've had, do you suspect that the Liberals will run pretty well as we saw last night?
Well, Bodmin, if they're on the brink in Bodmin, this is good for them in the sense it isn't one of their best hopes. I think there are other ones they have more hope in. I think we are going to see the Liberals certainly in double figures, but we really, every seat which the Liberals hold is so much a special case that one can't predict an individual one in the way that one can on the whole, as Bob Mackenzie showed on the swing, where the great bulk of seats went more or less on a national tide.
Fine, and we will, of course, be marking up these particular seats, perhaps when Mr. Wilson reaches his home in Lord North Street, just round the corner, of course, from Whitehall and the House of Commons. Perhaps he'll hope to have racked up 1 or 2 gains, and so that he and his colleagues can take a more judicious decision. I would suspect from the way Mr. Wilson is behaving, he is really very anxious to form a government, very ready to do so. He believes it is his duty, and he believes that he has the answers.
I think he is, and I think I can't see anyone else who could form a government granted this situation. I think that it's going to be very interesting how he forms it and what terms he forms it. That he will form it seems to me it's inconceivable that Mr. Heath could piece together a coalition, and you've got to have the leader of the largest party as Prime Minister.
In fact, your feeling is that Mr. Heath is in a worse position today than, say, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume was 10 years ago.
Oh, yes.
Well, that's perhaps news for the furniture vans and the movers, but Bob Mackenzie now with the polls.
I'd like to have a look again at the way the polls predicted things at the very end of the run-up to the election. The very last polls that came out on election day showed Gallup with a 2% lead for the Conservatives, ORC 3%, NOP 4%, Harris 5%. And if you gave a weighted average of that, it pointed toward a Conservative lead over Labour of 60 seats. Now, this is the second major rebuff the polls have had. Last time in 1970, 22 out of 24 polls pointed toward a Labour win. This time, more than 25 pointed toward a Conservative win, with one, I think, only suggesting it might go the other way. And we thought it rather sensible to bring together 3 leading figures in the world of polling. the Gallup leader, Mr. Norman Webb, general manager there, John Barton of NOP, and Louis Harris of the Harris poll, which also has links with the ORC poll. Well, now, gentlemen, on the face of it, this looks like a pretty serious setback to the ordinary lay observer of these matters. Mr. Harris, what's your reaction?
Let me say this, that an American mayor who's long since dead, Fiorello LaGuardia, said, when you make a mistake, be sure it's a butte. I'd say categorically that, at least speaking for our polls, that clearly we made a mistake in terms of saying there would be anything like a clear conservative win. I would point this out, that if you take the swing on the votes that have come in, there's every likelihood here this morning and this afternoon in the final count that the Conservatives will have more of the popular vote, which is of course what we do. I would also say this, that what we were asked to measure in this election was the equivalent of an earthquake taking place in public opinion in this country. Politics in this country, as the results have shown, have been torn up beyond recognition. The polls, if you will, were the very first to point out the surge of the liberals. I dare say that I doubt that anyone would have taken the liberals seriously if it hadn't been for the polls. Secondly, the polls showed, our own polls showed, for example, that no more than 40% ever thought that Labor would do a better job than the Conservatives in power. Where do you find the vote? Labor will be lucky to get 40% of the vote here.
But isn't the answer to that partly that you can measure all kinds of movements of opinion, but you're in real trouble if you allow newspapers to do what your poll allows them to do, and the others, to write sensational headlines, Ted home and dry, over polls that don't begin to prove that?
Well, I don't want to get personal about it, Mr. McKenzie, but I would say this. I followed all through the last 10 days or week of the election your own coverage of polls. And I think you, along with everyone else, and perhaps ourselves, and I'd put ourselves first, were far too absorbed with saying this is a horse race, who's ahead, who's behind, rather than saying what lies back of this, what is going on.
Yep. Could we hear Mr. Webb for Gallup? What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that I think Louis Harris is apologising too soon, because as far as Gallup is concerned, I have a strong feeling that at the end of the day, what we said is going to be very nearly correct. We talked about a 2% lead in the Conservative share of the vote, and it looks like it's going to converge to something like that. And so long as we're not misinterpreted, we're talking about share of votes. We've always talked about share of votes, and we've not been represented as doing anything else.
Well, now, I suggest to you that the stock market and the gamblers of the world in this country have lost very heavily by taking you all too seriously. That goes for NOP too, I think you'll agree. Mr. Barton.
Yes, I certainly agree. But I think that certainly we must stand by what we've said, and we do appear in the newspapers, and the newspapers, I think, from their own point of view, rightly say that this represents a Conservative or a Labour lead, because this is what their readers want to know. This encapsulates the whole thing.
But all the leads turned out to be wrong. We may come back to you later, gentlemen, I hope. Alistair.
Well, there are the pollsters, and their fingers, of course, crossed too. The count is going on now at Chelmsford. That's the seat which Mr. Norman St. John Stevens holds for the Conservative and is defending this time. Now, let's go for a declaration to Hendon North.
The election for this constituency was 80.89%. I, Frank Dale Gibson, returning officer for the Hendon North constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Champion John Stanley, Labour, 14,673. Edwards David Hugh, Liberal, 8,585. Gorst John Michael, Conservative, 17,000. 17,285, and that John Michael Gorst has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, supporters and opponents.
There's the result. Mr. Gorst, who's had a hand, of course, in the local radio lobby, and he is back in Hendon North. He would have taken it in 1970. I suppose it's a relief to the Conservatives, however, that he's held it this morning.
1% swing to Labour and a record poll up 11%. The whole of London has increased its poll by 10% as a whole, and they're much more than any other part of the country.
Result possible. Perhaps not last of all, because I would like to pay a personal and considerable tribute to the fairness and decency with which we've had this contest here, and to thank both the Liberal and the Labour candidate for an excellent and decently conducted contest. Thank you very much.
That's the situation then in Hendon North. Mr. John Gorst back. Let's look at some of the results this morning now in full. Here's Paddington. This is Arthur Latham's success, Nick Scott's defeat. And Nick Scott's campaign manager in Paddington also failed to get in at Putney.
Very low swing to Labour there compared to the rest of London.
And here we have Salisbury. Now we're getting out to the west again, but Conservatives in, Liberal second.
33% of the vote, and they didn't fight last time.
Here's Kenneth Baker back in St Marylebone.
Low swing, as in Paddington next door.
And a low turnout, too.
Yes, it always is a low turnout.
And we'll, of course, be having some more results as they come in through the computer. Now, David, well, you didn't expect John Gorst to lose Hendon North.
I didn't. None of these seats one expected. I mean, Paddington was the one seat that we've heard from this morning we could have expected to change hands. It didn't change hands from what our concept of what would have happened in 1970. Nothing has happened so far this morning to alter the prospects. We haven't heard from the places we're interested in.
All right, but Geoffrey Howe, of course, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who's been Minister for Trade and Consumer Affairs, he's heard from the place he's interested in. That's his own constituency, and of course he's back, but it would have been a real landslide if he had been out. Well, where are you particularly interested? We've got the recount in Bodmin. Now, what about this Derbyshire South East situation, David?
I should have thought that Derbyshire South East probably won't go to the Labour Party. It would be a very big swing compared to the ones we've had. Very few seats with as big a swing as that. I think only 2 have in fact changed hands.
And so it's Bosworth that we're waiting for?
We're waiting for, my view, we're waiting for Bosworth, Chorley, Beeston. These are ones that Labour Party could easily... And we're also waiting for Buckingham, where Robert Maxwell is trying to get back in his old seat.
A very colourful campaigner indeed. And of course he got back into his own company, Pergamon, but he waits now to get back to his parliamentary seat. We have 1 or 2 results to give you. Here's the Geoffrey Howe result in Surrey East.
Liberals, 34% of the vote there, second place.
And here's Mr. Douglas Hurd, who's been Mr. Heath's political secretary in number 10, now in as an MP in his own right. Down in the West Country, Piers Dixon, Conservative, but the Liberal chasing him up.
And that's the seat that Michael Steed fought last time. 37% for the Liberals there, but 12% too little. The Cornish Nationalist only got 850 votes there.
Nebian Kernow. Well, we are, of course, hanging fire here at the moment, as indeed, no doubt, the thoughts of Mr. Heath and Mr. Wilson and Mr. Thorpe are all hanging fire. I suspect that at this moment, though, Mr. Heath is waiting to see just what the strength of the Conservative government is. Would you suppose the Conservative Party is in this situation? We are excluding the possibility at the moment of the likelihood of his forming a minority government. That, I think, is true, David, particularly in the light that Mr. Wilson, from what he was saying to Michael Charlton earlier on, seems determined to form one if he can.
I think that that is so. I just don't see how the Conservatives could have any prospect of having a majority in the next Parliament, or any kind of coalition you could put together. that makes any kind of political sense at the moment. They only could continue in office if you can envisage a temporary grand coalition, which so far politicians have ruled out. Though it is worth noticing how extraordinarily cagey all the politicians who come near to having a responsible position have been. We had Lord Windlesham here this morning really saying no comment, in the nicest possible way.
Now, Mr. Wilson, in talking to his shadow cabinet colleagues, who may hope to become cabinet colleagues very shortly, perhaps before the day is out, he must have in mind whether there should be any deal, official or unofficial, with the Liberals.
I think he must. The trouble is that I'm sure he had plans for a drastic and dramatic takeover of Number 10, reorganisation of the private staff there, the CPR, the policy review staff and things like that. I don't think he is in a position to engage in that sort of dramatic action, except as a kind of challenge to the people whose votes he will need if he is to form a government for more than a few days.
And he'd be putting the Liberal Party in a bit of a spot because, of course, some of them will not be elected until late on tonight if they are returned in their seats. Joe Grimmond, of course, up in Orkney and Shetland, Russell Johnston in Inverness. David Steele, the Liberal whip, should know sooner than that, but again, he may be subject to recounts. So I don't suppose, although the Liberals no doubt are talking to each other, they are actually in a position to give any answers were they asked any questions.
And I shouldn't have thought they would be asked questions for a while. The parties have got to sort themselves out before they start talking to other people.
I think Baldwin took until the Monday. He went down to Chequers, actually, and thought it all out in 1929. I would imagine in modern circumstances we would have a quicker effort this time, but it's not perhaps the situation in which one would expect to see the new Prime Minister, or the next Prime Minister, how it's to be described, going through the door of Number 10 tonight and announcing his cabinet ministers.
Now, I think the trouble is this time we have a really urgent situation. If there wasn't the miners' strike, if there wasn't a fuel crisis, we could perfectly well wait for 3 or 4 days while people had their discussions. But I think there will be a pressure to make decisions quickly. And Mr. Wilson, of course, has taken this prior stand that he wouldn't negotiate, he wouldn't compromise with people or make deals, he would challenge them to turn him out. I wonder if that stance can be maintained in the present circumstances.
So there we are, and we await to how the situation is going, but down in North Devon, where Mr. Thorpe had his major personal success last night, David Lomax has a report.
Well, this is Thorpe country, and I hope it looks as beautiful as it really is this morning. And it's also Liberal country, according to a jubilant Mr. Thorpe. Liberal country all the way down from one end of the constituency of North Devon all the way down to the borders of North Cornwall. That's what he said, and a very victorious speech that he gave after the declaration last night in Barnstaple. We've come down here to the middle of North Devon, near the village of Cobberton, and outside a little thatched cottage called Higher Chuggerton. For it's in here that the leader of the Liberal Party, Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, has just got up. He's having his breakfast with his wife and his mother, and he's a man, of course, who still doesn't know whether really at the end of the day he will be holding the balance of power. But we hope that he'll be able to come out in a moment or two and talk to us. Last night there were ecstatic scenes. You may have seen them already as he was carried on the shoulders of his supporters from outside the Queen's Hall in Barnstaple, all the way around the Pannier Market, down towards the Liberal Party headquarters. But obviously his own delight must have been tempered by the fact that Liberals elsewhere weren't doing quite as well as he'd predicted. And that, of course, is one other point that we'd like to bring up with him when he does come out. Anyway, this is David Lomax at Higher Chuggerton.
Well, now, David, the countryside really is as beautiful as you say. When do you expect Mr. Thorpe to come out? Is he lying in late this morning? Well, he hasn't heard me, so all we can do is enjoy the scenery and hope to hear from Mr. Thorpe shortly. And now we have been joined by Michael Steed, who, of course, has worked out what the redistribution has meant, and we've been relying on his figures, and so has the computer been relying on his figures throughout last night, and we will continue to do so today. Michael, how do you think the redistribution has affected this result? Has it really, almost on its own, produced the deadlock?
I think it has. We've come out with some most interesting figures. There is no doubt in my mind that had the election been fought on the old boundaries, we would now be saying Mr. Wilson is the next Prime Minister. The situation is as follows. In Greater London, we've worked out that Labour have definitely lost 10 seats through the disappearance of 9 seats. The Tories have only lost 1 in Paddington, and they've gained the 2 new seats created in Bexley and Havering. Outside Greater London in the southeast, of the 14 new seats created, 1 Braintree is yet to come up, but I would predict it's a Tory seat. Labour have taken 1 in Luton. The Tories have taken all the other 12 In the rest of the country, Midlands, Scotland, Wales, South West, it more or less balances out. There are two to watch particularly affected coming up. Beeston, which the Conservatives are more likely to lose because of the boundary changes, and North West Norfolk, which I would add to David's list of key ones to watch, because although we've got it down as a notional Labour hold, on the East Anglian swing it might well go Tory. Assuming those go one way, one each way, this means that Labour are 9 or 10 seats down.
We must interrupt you a moment, Michael. I think we have a result at Finchley, Margaret Thatcher's seat.
I, Frank Dale Gibson, returning officer for the Finchley constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Brass Lawrence Stephen Liberal, 11,221. O'Connor Martin John Labour, 12,202. Margaret Thatcher Margaret Hilda, Conservative, 18,000. 18,180, and that Margaret Hilda Thatcher has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Acting Returning Officer, fellow candidates, fellow members in the hall, ladies and gentlemen. First, Mr. Mayor, it's my proud duty, I think for the 5th time now, to propose a vote of thanks to the returning officer and his staff for all the work they put in yesterday. It was one of the coldest elections. As far
Liberals came third in that seat, where they might well have hoped to come second or even to challenge Mrs. Thatcher. It was one of their great hopes when they put John Pardoe in there to try and win it in 1964.
As the non-temperature climate was concerned, this brings me to my second point. I am very proud indeed to have the honour of representing Finchley for another X years or months. We do not quite know how much.
Mrs. Thatcher, they are not prepared to prognosticate. Labour taking Meriden, that of course is in the Midlands, and it may have benefited from some of the swing which has been going Labour's way there, but that is a success certainly for Mr. Wilson. We'll have a look at those full figures here.
That is really a very remarkable result. It wasn't one we envisaged as possibly going to Labour, but the big swing in the Powell country seems to have affected it.
And another one coming up for Labour, they've taken Chorley. Here's Epsom and Ewell, the Attorney General, Sir Peter Rawlinson, but the big news for Labour, they've taken Chorley.
And that does push the projection up, I think, a bit.
And there is the situation. Mrs. Constance Monk's out in Chorley.
A 1.8 swing to Labour, but enough to turn the seat over to them.
And the news for the Conservatives is that they have held Harrogate. That was an outside Liberal chance, given what happened at Ripon, and they've held that seat as David suggested they were going to in Derbyshire South East.
Which was one of the ones, but they have actually just won 2 seats, one quite outside the ones we were suggesting, and one that was on the second most marginal, third most marginal still to come.
So the push, therefore, is Mr. Wilson's way. Let's confirm that with a fuller look at these results. There's the Harrogate one, which the Conservatives have held really quite comfortably against the Liberals. They must have been frightened by the by-election at Ripon next door.
But the Liberals did get 31% of the vote.
Mr. Orstick, the Liberal next door in Ripon, watching that, I'm sure. Here in Westmoreland, a safe Conservative situation.
But the Liberals very comfortably second, 35% of the vote, only 15% behind Mr. Joplin.
So there we are, and perhaps the centre of attention should now go while we await for further news of Mr. Wilson's arrival, the events at number 10, the events at the Palace. The city is in the forefront of the battle today. That's perhaps where the battleground for the pound is going on. Paul Griffiths reports from there.
And I'm afraid those bastions of the capitalism of this country in the City of London, the Bank of England and the Stock Exchange, are looking decidedly drab this morning. it doesn't just feel as though the temperature has gone down about 10 degrees in the square mile of the City of London. It seems that everything else has as well. You've heard earlier that the Financial Times index at 10 o'clock, that of course is the index consisting of the share prices of 30 of the country's companies, went down 25.5 to 312.3, when at 11 o'clock it was down even further to 310.0. That's down 27.8. And that means, of course, that the share prices of the 30 companies in that index have all gone down. I can give you some sort of indication of that drop, which is something more than 8%. When I tell you that ICI, for example, which is considered to be a barometer of the stock exchange and a barometer of industrial opinion, or the investor's opinion of industry at this time, was 232 overnight, 232 pence to buy a share, if you like, of ICI, is now down at about 213, having gone down as far as 211 earlier this morning. Land securities in the property business have gone down 27 pence to 183. And thinking about the banks, especially Midland, whose figures we're expecting today, results that is, profit, etc., have gone down 34 pence today to 290. In the oil business, BP have gone down 42 pence to 532, and I'm afraid the pound has been looking decidedly weak as well this morning. It has picked up a little bit, having been down. It was against the dollar 239, I beg your pardon, 230.5 overnight. It's now 2.279. So in other words, things in the City of London haven't been bowler hat bobbing this morning. They've been rather a slow march. People have their heads down there, really working hard and watching their television sets to see just what's happening.
On their television sets, they can see Mr. Wilson's plane arriving at London Airport. What a different return from the one he had in 1970 when he came back in the car with Mrs. Wilson, of course, in the knowledge of defeat. And here he's flying back with great speed. Came by train in 64 and 66, his two successes, this time right up to date, and following, indeed, the Queen into London Airport. And, of course, when he gets out, we know that he's going to his home in Lord North Street, and there at 2:30 this afternoon, consultation with his shadow cabinet colleagues, as I say, expect and certainly hope to become cabinet colleagues before very long. So Mr. Wilson now back at London Airport, and Chris Rainbow is there. Are there any special security precautions and things like that in Mr. Wilson's arrival?
Just the same security precautions the Queen had, not very evident, except you could see the occasional policeman on the rooftops. Passes are being very severely checked, but apart from that, nothing untoward, fairly informal. Mr. Wilson's plane is in fact in the same parking space as the Queen's Super VC-10 was about 3 hours ago when it arrived. I don't know whether that's some kind of an omen. And as he flew in, the flight path of his plane would have, as it approached Heathrow, would have brought him in over the Thames in central London. And I wonder if he caught a glimpse of the Palace of Westminster as he flew over, trying to work out just what his role will be there in the next Parliament.
There seem to be some celebratory flowers there.
Coming out with a small entourage of his Labour Party supporters. His press officer will be there. When he does come out, there's Mr. Wilson coming down the steps. A short flight from Liverpool Airport, about 1 hour, with Mrs. Wilson, being met by Mr. Jack Bannister from the British Airports Authority. Must have perhaps left his wallet behind or something, but I don't think he needs to tip anybody when he's flying in a plane like that.
Well, Mr. Wilson looks very happy. He's shaking hands, and there's a step of determination and confidence about him there. It may still be perhaps a little bit of a surprise, whatever he has said, but he certainly knows that he's stepping into a very difficult situation here in London town. And, of course, one has to put this point that however revivified politicians are by success, after 3 weeks of a bruising campaign, after many weeks of argument and debate in the House of Commons, in what situation are they? Well, he couldn't get the door open there, but perhaps some other secrets will be unlocked to him very shortly. That's the sort of thing that you take in your stride. Mr. Wilson now on his way back into central London to his home in Lord North Street. I hope they can get the engine started. Here we are. Anyway, here, a little way from him. He's on his way. Graham Pyatt, what's the news you have to give him?
Well, we've had 16 results since closed down last night. and most of them were fully anticipated by the computer. But we've had two Labour wins which have resulted in taking the Labour prediction up to 309, giving the majority over the Conservatives of 12. These Labour wins were not entirely unanticipated, but we did not expect Labour to win both of them. So they're edging up by 1 on the prediction.
And that, of course, throws the balance not just to the Liberals by any private arrangement that they have, it really throws it the nationalist way, doesn't it now?
Indeed, yes. We're still very much in this situation where either the Liberals or the Nationalists could be the co-partners.
Let's see what the latest on Mr. Wilson is. He's there at London Airport, and the retinue are coming in with the luggage and so on. And I don't doubt that he's filled with ideas of what's going to happen, but he needs to talk to 1 or 2 people, put these ideas across, and he's in for a very busy afternoon and evening.
Alistair, it's always interesting who are with great men at great moments. Did you notice Terry Boston and Gerald Kaufman and Joe Haynes were the 3 people around him at that moment?
And of course we've yet to hear from Terry Boston's old seat at Faversham. He's not standing this time. And there we are, a final word. And of course this is a very busy time. This is just the kind of situation where little details have to be looked at. There have to be last-moment thoughts and instructions. Which way you're going to go, and what shall I say to them, and somebody else is going to be on the phone.
Would you yet have a special branch detective? Not quite yet.
And here's the situation of the parties as Mr. Wilson comes into London at 5 to 12. As we say, the situation with the Conservatives 190 seats, Labour 258, but of course today's results to come in, Liberals 5 and others 5. We're waiting for more declarations to come in. Of course, this is beginning to get the busy time of the second day, and every one of these declarations that happens is of course of major interest, but Mr. Wilson no doubt will have his fingers crossed, perhaps listening to the radio as he comes into London to hear if any more have gone his way, as Meriden and Chorley have gone just as he was coming into land at London Airport. That's the kind of situation, of course, that he wants to see building up in the course of the next hour or 2. Bob Mackenzie.
Well, again, to look at the home counties and Greater London, the overall picture of the battle for London and the South East has been fairly clear since last night. But with the national result showing an apparently deadlock situation or neck-and-neck situation, every result that comes in this region, of course, is of vital significance. So first, let's look at the overall picture. In the home counties, we've had results from 40 of the 68 seats. So that means there's something like 30 still to come, less than half. And in London, we had results from 88 of the 92 seats, leaving a mere 65 we're still waiting for. 1 marginal is still to come. In the home counties, we're waiting here from Buckingham, where Robert Maxwell, of course, is fighting for a comeback. That, of course, is Conservative held, where a swing of 3% would take it to Labour. Mr. Axel held the seat, of course, before the 1970 elections. So here's the situation in the home counties, then. Conservatives hold 31 seats, having lost 2. Labour have 9, having gained 2, Gravesend and Luton East. And in London, the Conservatives have 38 now, having lost 4, Labour having 50, having gained 4. The gains were, of course, Ilford South, Battersea South, Ealing North, and Lewisham West. And there's been the marginal of Paddington expected to be held by Labour, just to be held by Labour. The swing has been interesting too. Liberals' share of the vote is up 14% in the Greater London area and 16% of the home counties, but no Liberal seats. Again, part of this sad picture from their point of view of good strength in many parts, but spread too evenly to make a real breakthrough. And of course, they lost Sutton and Cheam. They hoped to get Richmond, failed there, and Orpington also held by the Tories. Fine. A declaration now, Alistair.
This is
the percentage of electors voting at the election for this constituency was 82.27%. I, Frank Dale Gibson, returning officer for the Chipping Barnet constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Ellis Nestor Wynne, Liberal, 11,714. Maudling Reginald, Conservative, 22,994. Mills John Angus Donald, Labour, 12,183. The last figures were 12,183, and that Reginald Magdalen has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
Mr. Reginald Magdalen back there in Chipping Barnet.
4% swing again.
Of course, one of the reserves of power that the Heath government intellect, which the Heath government has not been able to call on in the past year or so.
Did you see the Conservatives have just held Eastbourne, which was one of the Liberal hopes? Stephen Tell had great hopes in the view of last time's election, but he hasn't won it.
No, so that's a little reverse for Mr. Jeremy Thorpe and his actual hopes of holding the mathematical balance of power. And we have news there of Conservatives holding Folkestone and Hythe there on the south coast. That's Mr. Costain. So still all to play for, although it's very hard now, increasingly hard as the results go on, to see how Mr. Wilson can break out of the deadlock. I think we're fairly clear that we don't believe that Mr. Heath can, barring some major upset in Scotland or somewhere else where he may still have hopes. But certainly results in the southeast and elsewhere in England don't, I think, give any prospect of that happening. Michael Heseltine, the aerospace minister, holding Henley. That's a seat that he's moved to from the southwest. He was redistributed out of the southwest. So Michael Heseltine, I don't think he'll be troubled with Concord in the next few weeks. However, a minority Heath government might, or a coalition government might. We really don't know quite yet what the answer is going to be. And with Labour's lead over the Conservatives at 63, with 172 seats to come, we are still saying that the balance is held by the Liberals and by the Nationalists. A little look at some results. Here's Henley. We saw Eastbourne briefly. Here's Henley. That's Michael Heseltine's result.
Liberals up into second place with 30% of the vote, but Michael Heseltine in.
And here's the disappointment for the Liberals. Mr. Ian Gow holding that seat for the Conservatives, Stephen Tyrrell failing to take it.
With a slightly increased majority compared to last time, both increased at the expense of Labour, but the Conservatives more.
And Derbyshire South East, Mr. Peter Rost, who won the old seat in 1970, pretty safely back this time.
This could have been one of the Labour's hopes this morning. It had been rather an outside bet. They haven't made it.
And Mr. Costain back, as he's accustomed to come back from Folkestone and Hythe.
Liberals in second place with 30% of the vote. They didn't fight last time.
And so there's the pattern with the Conservatives holding their seat at Westbury. Graham.
Well, no change in the prediction from these last few results, but on the slidometer, the position is quite clear about the balance. We have the minimum estimates for the Labour and Conservative parties shown here, and we expect that the Liberals and other parties will take about 30 seats. This means that whichever way we add it, either to the Conservatives or to Labour, there is no chance, as seen by the computer, of either party getting the necessary 318. This is the deadlock which the computer is very certain about.
While you were speaking, the Conservatives have held on to Faversham. That was one which they picked up last time, Roger Moat. He, of course, is rather critical of the common market, so perhaps Mr. Powell will take some confidence and further kudos from that situation. But Conservatives holding Faversham, that's one which Labour might have had their fingers crossed about, and certainly in earlier years would have hoped to have held. And we saw Terry Boston, the former member, there with Mr. Wilson.
It's a Labour seat all the way from 45 to 70, so it's one that Labour should have been winning if they were going to win a government. Well, they've probably won a government, but not a clear majority.
Now then, Graham.
Yes, well,
you have something to say. David was just actually saying that they perhaps have a government, but they certainly don't have a majority government. Is there any comfort that you can give to Mr. Wilson that he can look forward to for the rest of the afternoon?
yes, well, we have a list of the possible Labour seats that we expect to be coming through this morning. Here they are: Gloucestershire West, Norfolk North West, Bosworth, Beeston, Wrekin, Buckingham, Monmouth. Labour won't win all those seats, according to the computer, but it should get a good number of them.
Wrekin actually is a Labour seat, I would have thought. Anyway, it's an arguable one on the distribution. But
and I understand, in fact, Peter Thomas, that's the present Secretary for Wales, holding his seat in Hendon South. I understand that, in fact, not just redistribution, but the movement of population to Telford New Town makes it rather unlikely that the Tory will hold Wrekin on this kind of situation. Graham, well, you've told us the Labour prospects. What about the Liberal ones?
Well, indeed, we've got a list of the Liberal prospects as well. Colne Valley, Bodmin, Aberdeen West, Devon West, Orkney in Shetland, Montgomery, Inverness, Cornwall North, Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles, Ripon and the Isle of Ely. Again, we don't expect the Liberals to win all these seats, but this is where their best prospects lie.
And there's a recount in Bodmin.
Still going on, so they must be having quite a day down there. Let's look at some more results. The computer, of course, they're just telling us Conservatives have held Banbury, and we'll just see what are the important results that the computer has for us, that it's processing and chewing up and telling us all what the consequences are. There's Faversham. I wouldn't call it a Conservative gain, quite honestly. They had it last time. But certainly it's a relief to the Conservatives that Mr. Roger Moat is there, an anti-common market Conservative MP.
Something's obviously gone wrong. What could you tell me?
Mr. Van Strabenzie, who's a minister in Northern Ireland, at the moment back from Wokingham.
Liberals in second place, 28% of the poll, just ahead of Labour.
So, there we are. That's how it's shaping up, and we don't see any prospect at the moment of a breakout, but of course we haven't heard yet today from Northern Ireland. We haven't had any news really from the further fastnesses of Scotland, where Conservatives, Liberals and Scottish Nationalists are particularly slugging out, although of course Labour have a considerable interest in the seat up there in Caithness and Sutherland, and of course Bodmin, they may be settling down now to a series of recounts. So, still all to play for. I think we have another result. And here's Mr. Neil Martin, another anti-common market Conservative, holding his seat.
Just about the national average swing, 1.8, which is in fact the national average swing.
And Westbury, Mr. Dennis Walters back in a Conservative seat there.
But the Liberals in second place, 29% of the vote.
You notice there Mr. Thynne, who is of aristocratic birth and prospects, failing to turn that into a Wessex nationalist seat.
Less than 1% of the vote.
Rather Valley, strong mining seat.
And here's the first of these long, slow-counting Labour seats. Labour's going to get quite a lot of seats now from the Yorkshire coalfield, where they do count slowly.
Here's the Peter Thomas result, Secretary for Wales in the Conservative government.
Liberals in second place, 28% of the poll.
Former party chairman, of course. That's the last result that we have for the moment. Two anti-common market Conservative MPs coming back. One wonders whether Mr. Enoch Powell had any encouragement there. Although, of course, it would have been very surprising if Neil Martin hadn't come back. Well, now, we tried to have a word. We had a very pleasant word about the scenery, and Mr. Thorpe with David Lomax earlier on. He's still there at the garden gate. David?
Well, very beautiful scenery still and lovely sunny blue skies, but no further news of Mr. Jeremy Thorpe, who has been inside. He's had his breakfast, I imagine, with his wife and his mother. His mother came out, actually, earlier on and told all the reporters and the rest of us who were waiting around to go away. Mr. Thorpe and his agent last night told us that Mr. Thorpe would give us an interview sometime this morning, so we're just waiting for him. So that's all the news there is from Higher Chuggerton at the moment.
And of course, during the campaign, I imagine Mr. Thorpe would have kept his mother under very strong control, not giving that sort of advice. Now, Robin Day is talking to Margaret Thatcher after her result at Finchley.
Good morning, Mrs. Thatcher.
Good morning, Mr. Day. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. You looked very happy at your Finchley result, but may I take you back to some words you used in your speech of thanks when you referred to the government lasting X years or months. Now, did that mean you feel a sense of great uncertainty about the present situation?
Yes, it does, and I think most other new members do as well.
Can I just put this to you? Our computer predicts Labour ahead with a small majority, and the Liberals and others holding about 30 seats, holding the balance of power. What do you think should be the Prime Minister's course in this situation, as you can see it?
Well, you certainly do have a way of putting tricky questions. The Liberals holding a balance of power is a completely new situation in my lifetime in politics.
Liberals and others, which makes it even more difficult.
It does indeed. I don't like fragmented parties. I think on the whole there's only room for two views in this country in politics, because there's a good deal of middle ground in both, and I don't think there's any room for a third party to try and take the middle ground.
Well, it's taken it a bit, whether you like it or not. Can I put this suggestion to you? Do you think there's any possibility of Mr. Heath saying that perhaps another Tory leader might be able to command Liberal support better in this situation and could conceivably give way on that basis?
I should not have thought so. The Cabinet were fully behind the Prime Minister and the action he took, and I don't think that's likely to happen.
Do you think the election ought to have been held earlier?
No, no. I think he was right to hold it when he did.
Mrs. Thatcher, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Day. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
And with the news, of course, of a number of safe seats staying safe for the parties, let's have a look at some of these results. Bishop Auckland there, Mr. James Boyden, a former junior minister, safely back.
A swing above the average for the North East, which is a lower swing than the rest of the country.
And in Ludlow, Jasper Moore holding the Conservative seat.
Liberals in second place.
And from the Conservative part of Lancashire.
Another Liberal second place, but only just 24% of the poll for them. Mr. Hall Davis gets more than half the vote there.
And a strongly Labour part of Lancashire.
That was once Hartley Shawcross's seat. The Liberals in second place in an industrial seat ahead of the Conservatives.
Rather a Rochdale pattern almost. And here's Manny Shinwell's old seat, and Labour, of course, holding that mining seat.
Only 0.5% swing. Hello?
So there's the results, and these are results which bring some comfort to the Labour Party, though not whole comfort, but a good deal of pain to the Conservative Party and apparently to the City of London. We have some headlines there. City rocked, shares crash. Well, we've been hearing about that, and I have no doubt that the pound is in some trouble too at the moment. Well, with the City giving that account of itself, according to the evening papers, Robin Day is now talking to Reggie Maudling.
Mr. Maudling, forgive me if I concentrate not on your result, but on the national crisis. We've got an economic and an industrial crisis, and now on top of that we've got a political and possibly a constitutional crisis. What course would you like to be followed in this situation, assuming the computer prediction is right that the Labour Party are narrowly ahead, with the Liberals and others having 30 seats, roughly holding the balance of power?
Well, I'm not sure I accept predictions by computers any more than I do from opinion polls.
No, but that sort of situation.
Well, if it should finish up like that, presumably the Labour Party will form a government as a party, which is obviously better than having a coalition with the Liberals. I don't think coalition's a good idea anyway.
What do you think the duty the Labour Party has, Mr. Harold Wilson has, in this kind of situation, assuming he is sent for? Do you think he ought to make overtures to the Liberals to try and get some form of a centre type of government?
I would have thought not myself. I thought it's much better if a party has got a majority, however small, they should pursue their own policy. And in these circumstances, of course, they'll have to pursue a policy particularly aimed at strengthening sterling and avoiding any loss of confidence as a result of their victory.
What is that policy if you were at the Exchequer now? The shares have gone down 28 points, the Financial Times index, and foreign confidence is said to be doubtful. What needs to be done now, Mr. Maudling?
I think what needs to be done by a Labour government, if there is one, is first of all to make it quite clear they're not going to do some of the silly things they said they would do if they were elected.
Such as?
Vast increase in public expenditure, for example.
We've got to get the miners back to work, haven't we?
Yes, I myself believe they will go back to work on the basis of the pay board's recommendation when that comes out. They must realise it's not in their interest or in the rest of the country to do otherwise.
Mr. Maudling, in a word, how serious is our economic and financial situation now? People have been using the word disastrous, collapse, crash and all the rest of it. Put us right in perspective.
Those words are greatly exaggerated. The situation is serious, but there is no problem whatever that this country cannot solve by its own efforts.
Do you advise foreigners to lose confidence in this country because there is a minority Labour government coming in, perhaps?
Well, it'll affect things temporarily, but, you know, it'll depend how the government works it out. But the strength of this country is in its industry, its agriculture and its people, and no election result changes that.
Would you say its strength also lay in its capacity to find political solutions in an apparently insoluble situation?
I think history would rather back you up on that, Robin, yeah.
Thank you, Reggie.
And you would see there, while these conversations are going on, the Conservatives have taken the new seat at Hitchin. Shirley Williams, of course, moved away, or just moved off from it, taking some of the constituency with her, but that is a first failure for Anne Malalieu, one of the more decorative of the Labour Party's candidates. I think this is a chance to go down to Wales now, just to see how people are taking the results there. And I think it's Patrick Hannon who's down there with a report for us from Barry.
Yes, we're here in Barry where they're waiting for the result here. The counting's going on at the moment, and this is a Conservative held seat, but there have been some substantial boundary changes, although it is expected that Sir Raymond Gower, who's been a member here for 21 years, is going to hang on to it. Anyway, we'll talk to some of the people here now. You're obviously a Labour supporter.
Yes.
How do you feel about the results generally?
Very, very good. Could have been better. If we'd had not such bad rain last night, I think Labour would have had a landslide, and we can do with it.
It looks as though there's not going to be an overall majority. Does that concern you?
I wouldn't like to say it till the final results come out.
Do you feel the same way about this result?
Yes. What do you mean? As regards Barry or the country on the whole?
The country as a whole.
Oh, nationally, yes. What would you say that it was?
Nationally, it's very interesting and very good.
Well, exciting, wasn't it?
Can I ask you?
Yes.
How did you vote yesterday?
I voted Conservative yesterday.
So you're disappointed today?
Well, I'd rather wait until the final results come in. You know, I think it must be disappointing for either side at this point. I don't think either party are going to have an overall majority anyway, by the looks of things, up until I watched television last anyway. So just keeping our fingers crossed now that Mr Gower is re-elected for this constituency.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Patrick Hannon in Barry.
And some cautious political remarks from Barry. Let's just have a little look at the state of the parties. And there we have it. Now, David, you have a point about this.
When we started this morning, we said if no seats changed hands, the Labour Party would stick with 303 seats. They've gained 2 seats now, but quite a lot of other ones they haven't gained. And I reckon there are only 4 good prospects for Labour at the moment. They are Bosworth, Beeston, Buckingham and Falmouth. Those are the 4 seats we're looking for if the Labour Party is to make an advance. And if they won all of those, which I don't think actually is very likely, they would have 309 seats.
Well, it sounds almost like the beginning of a poem by Sir John Betjeman. However, let's look at the prediction board. And we're saying Labour lead over Conservative of 61, but there, after 477 results, you have the state of the parties as we expect the election to finish up.
So what I wanted to say then really was partly in answer to Reggie Maudling when he said he didn't have faith in computers. Now what I was saying then was not dependent on the computers, it was just dependent on the seats that have not yet declared but are remotely within the grasp of normal political behaviour.
Fine. Well, how normal is political behaviour in Britain these days? In Lord North Street now, that's Mr Wilson's home. It's also the home of a number of other people in the political and journalistic world. Keith Graves, anyway, is down there awaiting Mr Wilson's return from the airport.
Mr Wilson is due here at his home in Lord North Street any minute. We've heard that he's on the way from Heathrow Airport in a 4-car motorcade, as you probably saw earlier. The press and television from all over the world have gathered, and quite a few members of the public. One interesting thing is that whereas throughout the campaign Mr Wilson, as leader of the opposition, has not attracted much security, now there's a possibility that he's going to be the Prime Minister. The security around him is going to become very intense. We're all waiting here for him to arrive any minute. This is Keith Graves in Lord North Street.
And we're all waiting, of course, for these vital seats, which are the last ones that we think Mr Wilson has a chance of picking up on the swing as it has gone so far. Let's look at some of the fuller results which have come in this morning. There's Mr Ian Stewart, a merchant banker, taking the new seat at Hitchin.
Liberals only 17% there, a swing of 2.8% to Labour, but not enough to put Miss Malalieu back to join her father.
And here's Blaydon, no race there.
Safe mining seats. There's Blaydon or ex-mining seats changing in character, but no bigger swing in the mining seats than elsewhere.
Here's another mining seat.
And only 2.1% swing, just a shade more. It used to be the seat, it may still be, with the biggest majority in the country. 34 in England. They have bigger ones in Ireland, they may not this time.
Mr. Alec Woodall inherits that seat. And here's Kensington, which might have been marginal, but the Conservative, Sir Brandon Rhys-Williams, has held it comfortably. That's a seat where North and South Kensington largely merged. And a word now from Robert Mackenzie.
Let's take a look at the total votes picture again, because I think it's still terribly interesting. You see that the big parties, two major parties, are neck and neck, with the Liberals really still running at almost half the strength of the other two. Can we hold that just a second? And I've worked it out again. The Liberals have had to get 800,000 votes for every one member elected. Although they got half as many votes, very nearly, as the other parties, they've got 5 seats against the much, much bigger figures of the others, taking about 35 to 45,000 votes to elect one Conservative or one Labour MP. I've looked now at the share of the votes. Again, the story that is inclined to get lost, the fact that the two big parties have each lost considerably in public support at this election compared to the last one. Conservatives have lost more support, on the right-hand column there at the top, 7.3%. Labour has also lost 5.3% compared to the last election. And the only gainers in public support in the election have been the Liberals and the others, mainly nationalists and minor groups as well. That story must be kept in mind if one wants to understand what the British public has been saying in this election.
Well, now, Bob, the British public, we've said, wants fairness, and you've just indicated how under our electoral system, the Liberals can pile up this many millions of votes, doubling what they did last time, and yet get a very paltry return in seats. Now, do you think that part of the fairness, if one really had a little time to think it out and the parties were going to work it out, would move towards a change of the representational system? Or will we try another election on the old way?
Well, it's forgotten that we've had a recommendation in the past in favour of it. It's become, at various stages, an actual political issue. And I would myself think that either major party might now be prepared at least to set up a royal commission on the electoral system, even if that meant hoping to get Liberal support for a limited period of time, as it were. And I think this is a reasonable thing to do. No other country in Europe would have a situation like the one we've got, where you can get half as many votes and a tiny, tiny fraction as many seats as a major party. Now, I know the great advantages in the past have been that we usually got majority governments. This time it's come unstuck more spectacularly than it has in a very long time.
Well, perhaps one shouldn't just judge it because it comes unstuck one time.
No, but I think there's been evidence for some time now. Even in the 1964 election, for example, the Liberals got 1/4 as many votes as the Labour Party that won, but only 1/30 as many seats. So it's been going on for some time. This is not a plea for the Liberals, simply a time to look again at our electoral system, but the great authority on the electoral system sits on your left.
Yes, we're going to come to him and give him his chance in a moment. I can gather from your remarks, though you may not be selected as chairman of this Mackenzie Commission, you will give evidence to it.
I'm prepared all the
time. Robin is entertaining.
And with me, two distinguished American commentators, Charles Collingwood of CBS News and Garrick Utley of NBC News. Charles, you've known this country intimately since the days of the Blitz as a reporter. What do you think about this situation and our political problem?
I think exactly what you think of it, that it's confusing. It's going to be particularly confusing to the American government, whom I think showed their preference by having Henry Kissinger stop over here instead of anywhere else on the eve of the election. For the United States, it means the end of the year of Europe. If there is a Labour government, it means that there won't be any more European unity.
Does it concern you that in addition to American instability because of the Watergate and the impeachment possibility, we've now got another Western country with possible political instability?
Well, I suppose so, although there are plenty of European countries with minority governments. I think there is a lesson for the United States in this, in the sense that, like the British public, American voters are disenchanted with both the major parties, which means that a third force, not necessarily a third party like the Liberals, but a third force outside the mainstream of traditional politics, perhaps led by George Wallace,
But that's rather different from what Jeremy Thorpe stands for, isn't it? It's a third force of extremism rather than a third force of centrism.
Let us call it populism.
Oh, I don't think Mr. Thorpe would like that. Gary Gutley?
The impression in the United States must be really remarkable this morning, because over the recent weeks and months we've seen reports about the 3-day work week, the coal strike, power cuts and all of this. Now on top of it comes this general election, which was supposed to settle the issue one and for all, give a mandate to Heath or to Labour. And what do we have? Well, we see what we have here. And so Americans right now about this hour have been waking up, watching their morning television broadcast, either Charles or myself, reporting that there seems to be one heck of a political mess here. And I think there are a lot of hard questions being asked about what is the future of England.
Don't tell them there's too much of a political mess, because although that's what we're saying, we have a way of solving these problems quite smoothly. The senior civil servants will be there preparing the same memoranda for whoever comes in, and whichever is Prime Minister probably will do quite similar things, even with regard to the miners' dispute, perhaps.
Well, that's what I think people will be asking right now. The key question, what happens to the miners' dispute? Americans have sort of lost sight of that in the last few days of the campaign. We were talking more about the Liberals and whether Mr. Heath was going to get back to 10 Downing Street. But now the miner situation is in the front burner. And in addition to this, it's the whole question of the British economy. What is going to happen to the men on Wall Street? How are they, the big financiers, how are they going to look at Britain as a place for investment? What is Henry Ford going to think about this country?
And can you answer those questions?
I can't.
So brilliantly posed?
I can't. I can only ask them, like you.
Charles, what do you think will be the... Do you see the British political genius coming through this, or do you see a period of regrettable political instability? What are you reporting on that?
Well, what I'm reporting on this is that there will be a period of regrettable instability coupled with that genius for compromise and for making things do until the next election, which I would expect next fall.
Well, some people call it a genius for compromise, other people call it muddling through.
Yes, of course, but I was trying to avoid cliches.
Thank you very much, but in this, we get reduced to this at this time of the day after 11 hours on television. Alistair?
Of course, some people would say that senior civil servants were proffering the usual advice. It was perhaps the worst news we've heard since 10 o'clock last night when the programme began. Let's have a look now outside Mr. Wilson's home in Lord North Street, where the crowds of journalists, photographers, well-wishers and hangers-on are waiting for him to come through from the airport. And this, I think, is obviously going to be in the centre of all attention, and Mr. Wilson's colleagues will be joining him there for their discussions after lunch today. A couple of results, I think. Perhaps we have time for a couple of results. Here we go, and here's Mr. Edward Buchan, former chairman of the Conservative Party, quarrelled with Mr. Heath. He's held his own seat in Taunton.
A very low swing, under 0.5%.
And Workington, Mr. Fred Peart, he's of course been opposed to Europe, and he's back in his stronghold.
Swing to the Conservatives there, 2% to Conservatives.
And Mr. Caudle holding, well, rock solid Bournemouth East with the Liberal second. Mr. David James, who was among his pursuits, is hunting the Loch Ness Monster. No difficulty there, no real monster in Dorset North.
But this was a Liberal hope, and they got 39% of the vote, which is a very high, and the Labour Party lost its deposit.
Windsor and Maidenhead, Dr. Alan Glynn.
The Liberals just got second place from the Labour Party.
And Skipton, Mr. Burnaby Drayson, he's been the member there since 1945.
But Liberals running rather close, under 5% lead, 4.7% lead for Mr. Drayson over Mrs. Book.
And Rushcliffe there, Conservative back, that's a Midland seat.
It's been made much safer by redistribution. Mr. Clark is back in a seat that was Labour, was from 64 to 70, Martin Redmayne's old seat.
We'll have some more results, of course, quite soon. The computer is putting them through, showing them up. Let's see if we can get any report on one of the ministers we haven't heard from yet today, Mr. Willie Whitelaw. There's Ladbrokes have opened betting on the next general election. I wonder if how much money they've made on this one. All that money going on the Conservatives. A 3-to-1 on favourite, falling. It must be quite profitable. As I say, we haven't heard from Mr. Whitelaw yet, so let's go to his count at Penrith.
Here in Penrith, we're expecting the declaration any minute. Mr. Whitfield, the returning officer, is moving towards the microphone. Mr. Whitelaw's only just arrived. I'm told he's developed flu this morning, but he's still driven through the snow from his home at Blencoe, 3.5 miles away. They're still gathered round the table. Mr. Whitelaw's on the platform talking to the other candidates.
We're waiting, therefore, for Mr. Whitelaw's result, but while we're waiting, you would notice that headline there, Mr. John Pardoe holding his seat in North Cornwall. He'll be pretty pleased about that. Of course, he's been in national prominence as one of the Liberals, indeed the Liberals' main economic spokesman, and here's his result in North Cornwall.
It's a remarkable result. He's only been in by a very narrow margin. Now he's got a handsome thing, what you would call a safe seat if you hadn't seen Jeremy Thorpe in by 10,000. It's a very impressive result in Cornwall North. But we know there's a recount next door in Bodmin, the Liberals' other greatest hope in the southwest.
So that's the reason for the recount. Mrs. Trixie Gardner not doing well there. And Wallsend, again, there's a safe Labour seat up in the northeast coast.
An average swing there, slightly above the average for northeast.
And still in that part of the world, another safe Labour seat.
Slight swing to the Conservatives. It's not Mr. Wilkinson, wasn't a member.
And in Whitehaven, again on the northwest coast, again Labour. Mr. Hugh Fraser back again in Stafford and Stone.
9% up in the turnout. In the West Midlands as elsewhere, turnout is up everywhere.
Let's have a look, I think, now, how the city is taking this. We've been told how it's been bashed and bruised and what its initial reaction was, marking prices down. Paul Griffiths is there now. Paul, are things recovering, or what's the state of play?
Well, things officially aren't recovering. In fact, the Financial Times index, Alistair, has continued to go down. It's sitting at 311 at the moment, or it was at 12 midday. That's still down 26.7 points on the morning, so quite a considerable knock-off capital value of the top companies in the country. There's still rather long, rather confused faces here in the city. They're still waiting, watching, wondering, working, and just really wondering what is still going to happen and what it's going to mean for them. Let's find out, if we may be today from you initially, what's happening. Could there be a flight for the pound today?
Well, so far the reaction has been very slight indeed. Sterling has come down a little bit, but this is to be expected on the uncertainties involved anyway. And so far there's no sign of any pressure building up at all.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, we're waiting for the result from Penrith. It may be, of course, that the bank is in supporting Sterling. We doesn't quite know what is going on at the moment. It would have, I suppose, be a pretty sensible move. We'll go to Penrith now and see Mr. Whitelaw's count.
I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency of Penrith and the Border, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Peter Alexander, 8,202. William Hesmondhoff, 235.
Independent.
Joseph Norman David Weedle, 9,095. And for William Stephen Ian Whitelaw,
Conservative,
26,433. And that the undermentioned person, William Stephen Ian Whitelaw, has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency of Penrith and the Border.
A swing to the Conservatives, an impressive personal tribute from Mr. Whitelaw. The Liberals in third place, but Mr. Whitelaw's share of the vote up in absolute terms. There aren't many Conservative or Labour people of whom that's true.
Mr. Weedle, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Hesmondhoff, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Returning Officer, and all those people who have contributed, as they always do in this constituency, so well to the conduct of the election. I know how many people had a very long day in the polling stations and what the cold was like. And I have to admit to you, alas, that I have fallen a victim to this, and I am ordered by my doctor to go straight back to bed. But I know that you would expect me to be here and my doctor said no, but I was determined to come. I'm sure it was right, and I'm sure you will understand. I would like to thank Mr. Weedle, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Hesselthoff, for the way in which we have conducted the election. I believe it has been a moderate, fair argument, as the British people would expect. I believe, indeed, that all over the country there has been a very moderate, very serious argument. And I am the first to say that then, when the voters give their verdict, that is what the people wish. That is the will of the people, and it's a very good saying in life that if you are in politics, you trust the will of the people. I think it may be very difficult.
That's a very interesting statement by Mr. Whitelaw. It appears to accept the certainty of Conservative defeat. It might almost be interpreted as advice to the Conservative Party to accept that they are now in the minority and not to try anything else. Liberals holding Montgomery there, and that, of course, will be a little relief to them. They've fought a hard fight there in the past. A little look at how the computer is getting on with the results coming in now over lunchtime. Let's see some of them. Here's Mr. Ian Gilmore. He was Secretary for Defence at the end of the Conservative government.
Liberals more than double their vote from what we thought would have been the case in 1970, but of course it is a brand new seat.
I'm actually saying now the former Conservative government. I hope I'm not out of order, David.
Well, it's not the former Conservative government. Mr. Heath is still Prime Minister. These other men hold their seals of office until they surrender and they are ministers, or until Mr. Heath surrenders his seal on behalf of them. Is still in office.
I thought, though, Mr. Whitelaw was quite interesting there, wasn't he, in the way, the terms in which he took it.
Accept the will of the people. If you are in politics, you have to learn to accept the will of the people.
And there we are. He said it had been a fair argument, and again, the conclusion to take from that, perhaps, is that the Conservatives lost the argument. And we just have a word here. There have been two deliveries at number 10. We haven't actually brought you the picture of them, but the first was a blue wreath addressed to Mr. Heath. That was brought by taxi. And I gather the second is a consignment of lavatory paper, which arrived by lorry. I don't know whether that's stockpiling, but still, these are some of the arrivals at 10 Downing Street this morning. And now we have two new arrivals with Robin Day.
Well, they've been here sometime. One of them has been here before. Douglas Houghton, former chairman of the Labour Party,
is in the
Labour Party and a cabinet minister, and Tim Raisin, who is a junior minister in the government for the time being. But I want to ask Douglas Houghton this. What would you advise Mr. Wilson were you to be attending his shadow cabinet meeting in Lord North Street in a couple of hours' time?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not attending the meeting of the shadow cabinet.
I'm sure
I would like to have been there.
Yes.
I would strongly urge him to form a government if invited, either because Mr. Heath has resigned or if he goes to the House of Commons and is defeated. In either case, it's his clear duty, it's in the interest of the country, in the interest of the Labour Party, that he should accept the responsibilities of office.
And that is what Reggie Maudling said, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it's absolutely clear.
And no deal, no waiting to see what the Liberals want you to do?
No waiting and no shirking.
Let me put this to you, Tim Raisin. Mr. Whitelaw, who's, as you know very well, is one of Mr. Heath's closest advisers, going down with flu, going back to bed at a critical moment. Mr. Whitelaw said that the Conservatives must accept the will of the people, and Douglas Houghton will forgive me if I tell the viewers that at that moment when Willie Whitelaw said that, Douglas Houghton said, God knows what the will of the people is. Do you know what the will of the people is, and what do you think Mr. Heath's interpretation of it should be?
Well, I think it's very confusing, but if the Labour Party is the biggest party in this Parliament, then I would have thought the probability is that they would go ahead and form a government initially by themselves. They'd have to see how things worked out. They might do deals with the Liberals or with the other groups in order to keep in power, or they might find that the thing was impossible to carry on and have to pack out. But I'm afraid that the likelihood is of another election fairly soon.
In terms of the leader, do you think Mr. Heath would be the leader at that election?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Looking at Mr. Whitelaw's result, where he got a swing of almost 3% in his to the Conservatives, does that indicate to you perhaps that Mr. Whitelaw might be a Conservative leader, more likely to command the support of people in this new mood of the British people?
Well, I'm a tremendous admirer of Mr. Whitelaw's, but I still feel that Mr. Heath is the man. He fought a very good campaign. I think everybody recognises that.
Thank you.
While Robin was talking there, you would see the news that the Conservatives have held Carlton, but now Jeremy Thorpe is out and running in Devon North.
He's just going for a quick walk around the garden, and he's being pursued by a great posse of film cameramen and reporters. They all seem to have gone out of sight at the moment. They're down in the valley by the snowdrops and the daffodils. He doesn't seem to be giving any interviews or statements at the moment. And I hope we'll be able to talk to him when he comes back
Well,
here.
that's what's known as a brief public appearance, but not positively for the last time. And also the news has come in, and I must stress this because we made a silly mistake last night. Gordon Campbell has held Murray and Nairn apparently in the count, and that means that Mrs. Winifred Ewing, a hero of the Scottish Nationalist election at Hamilton, or by-election at Hamilton, has failed to unseat the present Secretary of State for Scotland. We'll go now for the declaration at the Wrekin.
I should do it quickly, otherwise you'll never get it in.
Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? In the Wrekin constituency, the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Gerald Teasdale Fowler, 30,642. Yearn George Powney, 11,487. Joseph Anthony Porteous Trafford, 24,121. And I hereby declare that Gerald Teasdale Fowler has been duly elected to serve as a member for this constituency.
Gerald Fowler, of course, who was member for the constituency between 1966 and 70. Dr. Tony Trafford, who took it then, out now.
4% swing to Labour, we reckon that.
And there is the full figures of Mr. Gerald Fowler's return to the House of Commons. And I'm afraid I have got to make yet another correction. I keep on making corrections about Murray and Nairn. I was wrong with the statement last night, I was wrong with the statement a moment ago, and now we can actually confirm, at least insofar as any confirmation can count from me about Murray and Nairn, that Mrs. Winifred Ewing is now, finally, the victor in Murray and Nairn, and that therefore is a defeat for Gordon Campbell, the Secretary of State for Scotland. I must apologise to you all about that.
That guarantees 3 Scottish and 2 Welsh nationalist members, and there is Gwynfor Evans in Carmarthen on a 10 lead on the 3rd recount. They're going to count again at 4.
Well, there's a bit of a gremlin. Here's the result, and Mrs. Winifred Ewing back in the House of Commons. She was there for Hamilton in the last, in the Parliament before the last one, and now she's back, and Mr. Gordon Campbell, Secretary of State, beaten.
The first defeat of a last defeat of a cabinet minister, the first defeat of a cabinet minister for quite a long while, since 1964.
Here's Devon West, Mr. Percy Mills holding that seat.
Impressive Liberal vote, 39, nearly 40% for, and a lost Labour deposit.
And there we are, and all my apologies to everybody living in Elgin and 12 miles round and Berghead. I don't think I can ever visit there again. Something wrong with that particular result as it was reaching me during the course of the past 24 hours. We'll look at some more results. Mr. Ronald Bell in Beaconsfield. Now he's on the right wing of the Conservative Party.
Liberals in second place, 28% of the vote.
Mr. John Biffin, who is perhaps closest of all to Mr. Powell in the Conservative Party in his economic views.
Liberals, 31%.
And here's Emlyn Hewson in that hard-fought seat in Montgomery, fairly safe for him.
It's the 3 leading Liberals have now got, respectable majorities. In the last Parliament, all the Liberals elected had very narrow margins.
And here's the Carlton result, David. Labour might have had some hopes there, but it's turned out to be fairly clear Conservative.
One of the question marks. It would have been outside bet, it would have been a 4% swing, but it was one of the question marks we had. There are still 4 seats the Labour Party might hope to win to come.
And Mansfield, a very safe Labour seat.
The low communist vote, as all the communist votes, except for Jimmy Reid.
And here's Mr. Eldon Griffiths, of course, who's been with the Environment Ministry and also with Sport. And there's Mr. John Farr back in the Shires. Well, David, with Carlton down, that leaves, what, 3 of your prospects, one of them in the West Country?
No, Carlton was an outside prospect. We've still got 4 prospects: Bosworth, Beeston, Buckingham and Falmouth and Camborne. I'd be surprised if Falmouth and Camborne went, but I really don't have a view on the present evidence about the others. I think Bosworth is Labour's best bet in those 3, and they might well carry all 3.
It was a very big swing to the Conservative of Bosworth last time, and apparently perhaps because the miners didn't like Mr. Woodrow Wyatt very much. They may have come back and shown their teeth this time to get the Tory out.
Yes. We've only had 3 seats change hands this morning, and we've had 70 results.
There's a recount at Hemel Hempstead
That's
going
a surprise.
on
That's Lord... No, it's not Lord Beach. To check on that one.
Well, there always are surprises, and it's no disgrace, in fact, not to be able to call the seats the way this election has been swinging. Perhaps we have some more results. Here's in Haltham Price, Mr. Patrick Wall back very safely there. And here's Staffordshire South West, Mr. Cormack, who was a winner in 1970, shifted a bit, and he's held this new seat very safely.
He defeated Jenny Lee in Cannock, and Cannock, of course, has now been redistributed into a safe Labour seat again.
We'll have a word, I think, now with Robert Mackenzie.
Indeed, I think it's very interesting indeed to see how it's tightening up with the possibility David got it down to 4 Labour possible wins. I guess that pretty well rules out the chance of the 318 they need. We forget, I name the figure often enough, 318 is what you have to get if you're going to have any overall majority at all. It does look, therefore, as if it can't really quite happen now, and therefore our thoughts are inevitably drifting to the idea there'll have to be some kind of minority government, if not some variation of that with support of others altogether. We now, of course, are up to 6 nationalists. Certainly more independent figures in Northern Ireland will be elected. 13 Liberal probability, and therefore Northern Ireland now.
Yes, so this is an important result. There's a serious reverse there for the Assembly system. The Vanguard United Unionist, the Reverend Bradford, taking their Mr. Rafton Pounder seat. In Belfast South, you see there how all the pro-Assembly parties, the Unionists, the Alliance and the SDLP, have split up, including the Northern Ireland Labour, Erskine Holmes, and that means that the Loyalist has got in Belfast South. Although, of course, he had no outright majority there.
That was thought to be the most certain pro-Sunningdale victory.
Well, it is, of course, a pro-Sunningdale victory if you add up all the parties that stand.
That's not how the electoral system works.
Not at the moment. Bob's trying to change it. John Davis there back at Knutsford. That's been the Conservative Minister for Europe. Interesting to see if Mr. Wilson forms his minority government, who he'll put in charge of the European situation. We've had Mr. Peter Shaw suggested, but we wouldn't say that that was official in any way yet. Let's look at the John Davis result in Knutsford. It is, of course, a safe Conservative seat held for many years by Colonel Sir Walter Bromley Davenport, and Mr. Davis inherited that and almost stepped immediately into the cabinet in 1970.
Moved in second place, only 28%.
And another mining seat, Mr. Eric Varley in Chesterfield.
Hardly any swing, slightly to the Conservatives.
And here's Mr. Rathbone inheriting the Tufton Beamish seat in Lewis.
Liberals in second place. Tim Rathbone was a former publicity officer for the Conservative Party.
And here's Bedfordshire South, safely Conservative.
I visited that seat in the election. All 3 candidates told me they were going to win. Now I know which was telling the truth.
Well, just come campaign talk there, I suppose. And here's in Bridgewater, again, Conservatives there, and in the West Country, Labour coming second, which is quite remarkable for them.
Yes, the Liberals close behind.
And here's Ince racking up another customary Labour majority.
But another mining seat with just about an average swing. No special reaction in the mining area as to an election called on a mining dispute.
Well, perhaps one shouldn't take that as a judgment on what the miners are likely to do when the Relativities Board reports. Of course, that is going to be the big headache of the incoming government, whichever it is and whoever the ministers in it are. We'll have a little look at the prediction now. After these results, we say at the moment, the computer tells us, the Conservatives likely to have 300, Labour 307, and there we are caught still in this apparent trap of a minority
So
government.
there's one seat we haven't mentioned yet that's still to come, and that's North West Norfolk, which is roughly the old King's Lynn, which we thought would be a Labour seat. But in the light of the Bury St Edmunds result, we do think that perhaps it's slightly odds-on that the Conservatives will hold it in a grudge match between Mr Page and Mr Brocklebank Fowler. Mr Page is trying to win the seat back. It's one to watch, Norfolk North West.
Mr Brocklebank Fowler taking it in 1970. Well, we're watching for these seats, and we're also watching at the moment for Mr Wilson's arrival at Lord North Street. Well, here is the man of the moment, perhaps of the hour, and perhaps of the next ministry. He's smiling, certainly a great revivification. We've seen a tired Mr Wilson here and there in the campaign. There's no question about it. He is a confident man now, coming home to some difficult thoughts, but being acclaimed, Keith Graves talking to him.
Not about politics at all. Can you just have a brief one? Mr Wilson, I know you don't want to talk about politics at all, but you've led a very, very hard campaign, as we know. Are you feeling tired now?
Well, I was up till 5 o'clock and I'll be ready for some sleep.
What's the first thing you're going to do when you get here?
Eat. Have lunch. I'm waving. All right then.
Are you expecting you might be later in the day be going down to the palace? Or are you not saying?
I to the state when I said in Liverpool.
Thank you, Mr Wilson.
Yes, later.
How much later?
Probably after the Cheddar Cabinet.
One last wave, Mr Wilson.
All right then.
And that'll be about what time? About 3 o'clock?
Later.
All right. Here's Devon North and the Thorpe retinue.
Mr Jeremy Thorpe's just coming out now. He's... We're live on the air at the moment, Mr Thorpe. Could you give us a brief interview for the BBC,
Indeed,
please?
David,
Are you a happy or a disappointed man this morning?
Well, I'm delighted that we have already gone past the 4 million mark. I am outraged that we have an electoral system which only gives those 4 million 7 MPs. And I think there will be 4 million very angry people who will feel that they have been cheated of parliamentary representation by an iniquitous electoral system. We are already, after all, enjoying a vote which is roughly half that of the other two parties. And there's no doubt we shall be beyond the 5 to 5.5 million mark. And it really is time that this system was changed. It's a crazy system.
Will that be the price of your support of a minority government, or one of the prices that you will demand electoral reform or proportional representation?
Well, first of all, I don't think I like the word price, but I suppose you're entitled to say it. And secondly, I don't think this is the time or the place to state what would be the sort of policies which we would support on the part of an incoming government. But obviously, it's quite clear that we attach very great importance to reforming the electoral system, which is long overdue. And the Conservative government, with the support of the Labour Party, have already amended it in Northern Ireland, precisely for this reason, that minorities were artificially suppressed. But of course, also, it does give voters a far greater choice within their own party. They can vote between a moderate or an extremist without splitting the vote.
How do you view the prospect of a minority Labour government now?
Well, I'm told that the prospects are the possibilities that we might have either. I don't know. I think it's far too early to say.
And the possibilities that the Liberals could hold the balance of power?
Well, this is a possibility. I think it's still a little too early to predict. It looks as a real possibility. But this is what the electorate have decided. They are not prepared to give a Conservative or a Labour administration a clear majority. And clearly this is an indication, with our 5 million votes behind us, that they would like us to exercise a moderating influence. That we shall do. Whether we do so from the opposition benches or in other ways remains to be seen.
What's been going through your mind this morning as you've been in the House there listening to the results and on the telephone? We could hear the telephone going the whole time. What was going through your mind as you realised you were coming nearer to holding the balance of power?
Well, this had always been accepted as a possibility. I think it places upon one an enormous responsibility. I think it also gives one an immense opportunity to try and be a moderating influence in British politics. And it's something which one approaches with, I hope, humility, but also with the knowledge that, apart from the immense responsibility, one has immense opportunities to do something for the country.
Well, you say moderating influence. What, in practical terms, does that mean over the next few days?
Over the next few days, I don't think in the next few days. I think that we don't even yet know the outcome of the election, and I shan't be going to London on present form until Monday, when I'm meeting my parliamentary party. No, I think that it's quite clear this election was caused call because the government had reached a state of total confrontation with the miners, when in fact that miners' dispute could have been settled by setting up the Relativities Board earlier and backdating, as has now happened, and referring the miners' case immediately, all of which I suggested 3 to 4 weeks ago. I think there has been a divisive element. I think likewise much in the Labour Party's manifesto has alienated vast sections of the community here, and I think this is a notice to both the other parties that they must drop some of their more extreme measures.
Finally, very briefly, has Mr. Heath been in touch with you today, or do you expect him to be?
I've only had two telephone calls from politicians. One is from the present member for Rochdale, and the other is from the Count from the future member for Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles.
Mr. Thorpe, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
By that he means his chief whip. That's the Liberal leader. Let's go now to a Liberal winner, Robin Day, speaking to Stephen Ross, the victor in the Isle of Wight.
Good morning, Mr. Ross.
Good morning.
How did you manage to turn a Conservative majority of 17,326 into a Liberal majority of 7,766?
Well, hard work, enthusiastic team, and it's my third attempt. We went against the grain in 1966. We should have done a lot better last time. This time it's all come good.
What are you, a surveyor and a farmer?
Yes, I gave up private partnership in a charter surveyors at the end of last year, and I am now farming, yes.
In the Isle of Wight?
Yes.
Whereabouts?
Near Brook.
And for the benefit of people who don't know the Isle of Wight, whereabouts is that?
Well, that's at the western end, near the western end of the island, what we call the West Wight.
How many acres?
Well, at the moment I have a bit over 200. Most of that's rented, and I have to give up 100 of that.
Well, now, what will you want the Liberal Party to do in this situation where the Liberals and others hold a balance of power, or are likely to, with a minority Labour government?
Well, that's a question you'll have to put to me another day. I'm the new boy, and I'm certainly not sticking my neck out at this situation. I think it's very important that the country is governed, and I think it's very important there shouldn't be another general election too soon, because I don't think the public will wear it.
And you don't think the Liberal Party will be ready for it?
Oh, I think we're ready for it. I think, in fact, we might do very well indeed, because we've been polling consistently over 30% here in the south. And listening to Jeremy, I entirely agree. I think it's absolutely wrong that we're polling all these votes and we're only getting the few members that we are.
Yes, well, you've polled nearly 5 million now, yeah. And you've got 7 seats on the basis of 5 million votes. So
yes.
You've made your point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ross, for joining us
Thank you,
in
Robin.
Southampton, new Liberal Member of Parliament for the Isle of Wight.
And with the headline there that Leon Britton, a Liberal Conservative lawyer, has won the new seat there of Cleveland. And that's the situation which we've been discussing. Big numbers of seats for the major parties, and the Liberals, despite their votes, still only with 7, though they still have some hopes. And a little look at the state of the parties. Closely coming in, Liberals 7 and others 6. That's where the balance is held at this particular moment, coming up to 5 minutes to 1. And I've no doubt at all that one of the controversies after the new Parliament meets will be this question that a party can get so many votes and so few seats. But David, you have a point about the votes.
Well, the votes at the moment, the Conservatives are only 170,000 behind the Labour Party. We're sure they'll end up at least 200,000 ahead on Great Britain, leaving out Northern Ireland. And indeed, our projected figures don't include any Ulstermen as Conservatives. Now, some will be voting with the Conservative Party. We may end up with the Conservatives comfortably ahead in votes, and within 1 or 2, or in some conceptions of how you count the Ulster Unionists, ahead even in seats. It's not clear.
Because they do have that disappointment in Belfast South. That's one they certainly were counting on.
On that basis, the Loyalists could have 10 seats out of the 12 in Northern Ireland. There's no seat that's certain for anti-loyalists, I think.
Well, let's see how people have been loyal in London. Robert Mackenzie.
Well, in the home counties, the main part of the story is now almost over. The Conservatives have held 42 of their seats, with 2 losses, Gravesend and Luton East. Labour's picked them up and added to their 9, their limited holding always in this part of the world. We're now, of course, intensely interested in Buckingham, which is still to come, Robert Maxwell fighting there, and it will be very important for Mr. Wilson to have that added to his list of wins, if possible, today. And, of course, we're also interested in the Hertford and Stevenage situation, where Shirley Williams is very much involved in an important struggle, too. Now, as we look at the way things have gone in this area, it's been fairly predictable. Labour has held all its marginals in the southeast and picked up Gravesend and the Luton seat as well, with the Conservatives holding Oxford and Dover and Deal, with Buckingham as the unresolved marginal still to be heard from later on. In the Greater London area, again, the story is now virtually over. The Conservatives have taken 41, losing 4. Labour has picked up 4 to add to its 50. And we've got the picture in Ealing North, the Gaines, Battersea South, Lewisham West, and Ilford South. Otherwise, considerable stability, of course, with the Liberals losing their by-election previous win at Sutton and Cheam. The total vote is interesting, I think, in this London area. The Conservatives are down, rather percentage of votes. The Conservatives are down from 43.8 to 33.8 from a previous 51% of the vote in the area. Labour is also down from 36% of the vote to 30% in the London area. The Liberals have picked up from 13 to 25.6. Again, a quarter of the vote in the London area and nothing to show for it. Partly spread too evenly, and they haven't managed to pick up the Liberals the places they really had hopes for, like Richmond and others. So again, it's a sad story for them, merely pointing up the story that's happened nationally at the same time. There's one result to come, Chelsea, but of course it's assumed that probably will stay rather comfortably in the Conservative column. I'd like to say a word also about some of the names of people who've been turning up, and some of them will be very important figures in a possible future government, which could be emerging on Mr. Wilson's side now. Michael Stewart is back, an elder statesman in the party, but might easily turn up as a peer and a member of a new government. John Fraser, Home Affairs spokesman, back for Labour. Peter Shore, very much back, and obviously going to play a major role in any question of renegotiation in the common market relationships. Joan Lester, back in the southeast also. Douglas Jay and Bob Mellish, a key figure undoubtedly in any future Wilson government. Now back to Alistair.
So there we have it in London, and David is actually, I think, sitting at what we must call our recount desk, but we'll call him. Where are the recounts now, David?
We've got recount in Hemel Hempstead. This was very much an outside bet for Labour to take, but there is a recount there. We don't know what the basis of it is. There is a recount in Bodmin, where the Liberals are hoping to take the seat, and there is a recount in Carmarthen, where rumour had it that Gwynfor Evans, the former Welsh Nationalist MP, is 10 votes ahead on the third recount.
So plenty to play for there, even though these are not exactly seats in London and the southeast. These are seats which will, of course, each one of them, if they went the right way for the party or the wrong way for a particular party, could still have a major effect on the whole atmosphere in which the next government is formed. And Mr. Bill Craig is in at Belfast East. And here's Hertfordshire East, Derek Walker-Smith, an opponent of Europe, back safely in his normal seat, a normal part of the country.
That Craig result is very remarkable. Wasn't expected he would do it. He has done it.
And the Labour leader with the Conservatives at this time, 33, with 107 results to come. We still put the Liberals and other parties, nationalists particularly, holding the balance. And a very important result, there's Mr. John Payton, the former Minister of Transport, or still Minister of Transport, back in his position. We'll have a look at Mr. Payton. Not a very important result. I'd like to talk about what's happening in Northern Ireland, I think, now, because the news that Mr. William Craig, who's been a major opponent of the Sunningdale Agreement, I don't think there's Dr. Gerald Vaughan, the Conservative in Reading South.
Remarkable result, actually. That was almost a marginal for Labour, and they're pushed down into third place.
Well, there's the situation. He, of course, made a very good speech, Dr. Vaughan, on the thalidomide issue in the House of Commons. Been a very good member, I think people would say that locally. Now, on this Northern Ireland point, Mr. William Craig has won Belfast East, and we've also had the success of the Loyalists in Belfast South. Now, this is not a promising situation either for the Assembly and Mr. Brian Faulkner in Northern Ireland, and it also seems to suggest that the Loyalists are really going to run very strongly indeed in Northern Ireland, which may not be a promising situation for anybody trying to organise a minority government in London. So it's in this situation, with Northern Ireland, of course, in many ways still on a knife edge. We've had the explosions, of course, in Belfast overnight. We have this new Assembly trying to settle down, facing its problems. It does look, I think, David, as if the opponents of the Sunningdale Agreement are running very strongly there.
I think so. I think it's very important, and I think a very grave sort of sideshow to the main thing, but it's going to have a major effect on the main thing.
And I suppose if it's Mr. Merlin Rees who might have that Northern Ireland portfolio, succeeding Mr. Francis Pym, if Mr. Wilson does form a minority government, this will not be very encouraging news for him in the job that he would expect to take up. So there, indeed, with the Northern Ireland card, it has been called many things in its day. It's been called the Joker in its day. It might now perhaps be called a rather more ominous name. However, this is the voice of democracy in Northern Ireland, and this is the situation that the Loyalists have said was the true situation, and they are now coming back. Well, we will hope to have some comment from Northern Ireland about these results shortly. Labour holding the Dearne Valley. That, of course, is a mining constituency again, and they'd be surprised if they hadn't won it.
And the Conservatives held Worcestershire South, Joel Nabarro's old seat, which the Liberals hoped they might have made a by-election breakthrough. It was the one seat vacant at the dissolution.
Well, they missed their chance because the by-election wasn't held. The general election overtook it. We'll have a look at some more results, starting with Mr. Angus Maude, a familiar face in Stratford-on-Avon.
Very comfortably back, but Liberals up into second place.
And in the marches, we have Sir John Langford Holt back again.
An echo, very comfortably back, but Liberals up into second place.
Going a little further north into Wales, and the Conservative holding one of their safer seats in Wales.
Well, it was a disappointment for the Liberals, and it was one of the Liberal target seats. They talked about winning it, and they haven't won it.
Now, here's one David and all of us have been watching for, I think, coming in now. This is the Beeston result, with the Conservatives holding a Labour gain possibility.
If Gardiner fails to get back into the House, that's very important, Beeston, for our final projections of the result, and the touch-and-go situation on how many seats Labour will get. Whether the projection will stay at 307 or drop to, say, 306. Certainly they're way below the 318.
James Lester, Director of Leather and Footwear Company, holding it for Conservative. Here's Derbyshire West, Mr. John Scott Hopkins.
Liberals coming in and getting 28% of the vote in second place.
And again in Dorset West, now the familiar pattern in the West Country.
32% for the Liberal there, but the Conservatives comfortably in.
We have a correction to the Bedfordshire South result, but of course it doesn't in fact affect the Conservative success. I believe the second and third candidates were put in the wrong way round first time. And here's Melton. This was Mervyn Pike's seat, and the Conservative successor holding it comfortably.
We're going to have a lot of seats like this. Liberals getting second place in a safe Conservative seat.
I think we should have a look at where the counting is still going on. I think we could go now to Chelmsford. That's the seat of the present Minister for the Arts, Mr. Norman St. John Stevens, and Esther Ranson is the reporter.
Yes, well, Michael Hartley is the recording officer here, and he's just making the last-minute confirmation. I think this is actually the first time he's been a recording officer at an election, so it's probably a slightly nerve-wracking moment for him, and obviously it is for Norman St. John Stevens, scholar, wit, television personality, and for 10 years he's represented Chelmsford. He's also been responsible in the government for the arts. The Liberal campaign here has been quite flamboyant in its way too. I gather there have been ballet dancers in the precincts, even an Irish wolfhound decorated with rosettes. He's from Chelmsford, he's a local man, and he's fought his campaign on local issues like juggernauts. They have traffic problems in Chelmsford, and Maplin, which is a local issue here. There is a...
So we'll go back, of course, to get that result from Chelmsford in a moment. We'll have a chance, I think, to look at one or two other results which have come in while we were there. Here's Michael Grills back in Surrey North West.
Liberals in second place. We've got 100 seats to come, and a lot of them will be like this. But some will be mining seats, and some will be from Scotland.
And here out in the Shires again, Mr. Peter Tapsall back in Horncastle.
32% of the vote for the Liberal there, pushing up into second place.
And a look at that Worcestershire South seat, which we mentioned earlier, the Gerald Nabarro inheritance.
And the Powerlight candidate only got 1.4% of the vote there.
And here's the Labour, Mr. Wainwright, holding safe mining seat. We still have to hear from the Liberal, Mr. Richard Wainwright, in the Colne Valley.
And the Liberals got into second place in a mining seat. It's not in another safe seat, but the other way around.
So a bit to play for. And now let us go back to almost to the very origin of the election. Robin Day is talking to Mr. Joe Gormley and to Frank Cousins.
Well, now, Mr. Gormley, if Mr. Wilson is on the end of this telephone and he says to you, Joe, what do I have to do to get the miners back to work within 48 hours? What do you say to him?
I say invite us across and let's talk about the issue and let's see how we can get to a position where the members can accept the increase and get back to work as soon as possible.
Having got into those talks, what would you be asking of an incoming minority Labour government which is in a difficult situation?
You know, Robin, I've been asked that question so often, and I'll tell the lads when we're over the negotiating table rather than tell anybody over the television cameras. I believe that negotiations are subject to the negotiating room.
I realise this, Mr. Gormley, and I'm not trying to embarrass you, but there are millions of people watching who have a deep concern as to what the miners are now going to do. Because, but I'll come back to you, Mr. Gormley, and let you think about it, because I'm going to go to Chelmsford, where Norman St. John Stevens' result, one way or the other, is coming through.
I, being the Deputy Acting Returning Officer for the Chelmsford constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. Stuart Gordon Mole, 21,929. Francis Morell, 16,063. Norman Anthony Francis St. John Stevens, 28,560. And that Norman Anthony Francis St. John Stevens has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency.
I must first thank the returning officer, Mr. Hartley, and his staff for the wonderfully efficient way in
Liberals second with 33% of the vote. Norman Stevens' vote drops by 11%. The Labour vote drops by 12%. And so it's actually a slight swing to the Conservatives, except we don't talk about swinging seats where the Liberals come second.
Perhaps I can say to Stuart that I did describe him as an untried young man. Well, he has been tried and found to be an extremely good candidate indeed. And I want to thank all my supporters for their hard work. This has been a very good result for us because we lost 13,000 voters in some of our strongly Conservative areas. And finally, may I say that Chelmsford has honoured me for the 4th time by electing me as member for this city and surrounding district. And I shall continue to do my best to serve everyone in this constituency, irrespective of party.
And there's the speech by Mr. Norman St. John Stevens with some praise for his young Liberal opponent, Mr. Stuart Mole. You would see there, while we are hearing Mr. St. John Stevens, that Mr. Clement Freud has held the Isle of Ely for the Liberals. He was rather a surprise by-election winner, and it wasn't a very safe seat for him, but he fought it hard, and the news about the posters there and the way things were going suggested he was going to do well, and he certainly has done well. We'll get the details to you just as soon as we can. Well, when we have more important news, of course, we'll give it to you, but I think we had to go away from Robin Day a little bit too quickly there. Let's go back to him again now.
Mr. Gormley, you were going to tell me what you thought the miners would ask for from an incoming minority Labour government, weren't you?
Well, I didn't need to do much thinking. We've been negotiating for the last 3 months, and people know the figures we've been negotiating on, but we've been in a negotiating position, and it was only last week where we submitted evidence to the pay board on the relativity check. So nobody needs to be in any doubt of the intentions as to where the miners would like to go, and I don't think whether it's an incoming minority Labour government or not would alter the situation at all.
But how soon could the mines be working again, given things going goodwill on both sides? And
if there was goodwill immediately the Prime Minister's known, I'm sure we could have the miners back to work within a week, as long as there is the willingness on both sides to make this possible.
And How much? Well, will you give us any indication? Mr. Wilson may be watching you now. He might like to know how far you want him to go.
I say I'll whisper in his ear rather than tell you.
Right, Mr. Gormley. Now, Frank Cousins, you were a member, some people may forget, but of course you haven't. You were a member of the incoming Wilson cabinet in '64, weren't you?
Yes.
Bearing in mind those circumstances, which were in an economic crisis, not as serious as this one, though you thought so at the time, thought it was serious then, what mistakes should a Labour government, an incoming Labour government, avoid?
Well, it should get out of the idea that it had to control the trade unions in order to make economic recovery possible. Each government for a number of years has thought that it needed to lay down some pattern as to which people like Joe should adhere, that they should be told before we start how much they can have and accept that as the will of the Medes and Persians. Well, I think the Labour government have got over that phase in their history, and since 1969 have been trying to say that the partnership with the trade unions was the only way in which you could get a solution to industrial democracy problems. So that would be, I think, the first lesson that they would have to learn. The second one is
You mean, what you're saying is abolish statutory controls on wages, pay board immediately?
And have, in fact, understandings with the trade unions as to how they would present the economic facts to them so that assessed and intelligent judgments could be made by men who lead these powerful trade unions in the interests of their own members and in the community in total.
Granted that all trade unionists, and indeed perhaps a great many Conservative ministers, dislike statutory controls over wages in principle. In this particular economic situation, with inflation serious, the balance of payments serious and so on, is there not a case in this emergency for a minority Labour government keeping the controls on for a little while working towards a voluntary social compact contract
Well,
with
you know,
trade union?
In 1956, I made a speech in front of the TUC in which I said, if we're having a free-for-all, then the people I represent are part of the all. So if you think
John Brady, 3,088. Gerard Fitt,
SDLP,
19,554. Again, 19,000, I'll say again, 19,554. John McQuaid, John McQuaid, 17,374. Albert Price, 5,662, and that the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as a member for the said constituency, Gerard Fitt.
Mr. Presiding Officer, Mr. Kerr, I would like to thank you and your staff for the wonderful, efficient way in which you have carried out this plan. All I can say is that to have won this election with such
So there's Mr Gerry Fitt, who is the deputy leader of the new executive in Northern Ireland, the Sunningdale Agreement and the SDLP, holding Belfast West, of course, one of the most bitterly fought seats at almost any election in Northern Ireland or a United Kingdom election, and Mr John McQuaid there failing to upset him. Here's the Belfast East result. This is a success for Mr Bill Craig in Belfast East. Of course, we're still to hear from North Antrim and the Reverend Ian Paisley.
Just a pro-Sunningdale majority there if you add the 3 votes, pro-Sunningdale votes up.
Whoa. And, of course, we have some other very interesting news for Liberals, which you will have seen while we had these exchanges. Conservatives holding Angus North and Mearns, but again it would have been surprising if they had lost it. But of course you've seen that for the Liberals, Mr Clement Freud has held the Isle of Ely, but the Liberals have lost Ripon back to the Conservatives. Now Mr Freud took that narrowly in a by-election. He makes it look like a safe Liberal seat. Mr John Stevens came back and fought it again, and he hasn't succeeded where other Conservatives have. And in Ripon, where Dr Keith Hampson is the Conservative, they've taken it back.
Almost all the Liberal victories have been on a grand scale. They all last time, they were all very narrow. But they've had great disappointments, but where they've won big.
Well, Dr Keith Hampson is a lecturer in history. He's a former personal assistant to Mr Heath. He nursed Bexley for him at the last election. And here we go to Hereford, Mr Gibson Watt, who is a junior minister of Welsh Affairs in the Conservative government.
And quite an impressive Liberal vote, 34% there.
And a little bit of good news for Mr Wilson, I think, just on the way. Not a surprise, but just the sort of thing that he would quite like to hear about Labour holding Caithness and Sutherland there.
Yes.
Mr McLennan. Now, here we are in the South Fylde, and that, of course, is very, very strong Conservative territory, Liberal coming second.
Caithness was one of the few Liberal hopes of gains in Scotland.
Although I think Mr McLennan has really begun to make it his own seat on a personal basis now. And now we go down to the valleys, and safe Labour seat, Plaid Cymru coming second, but not really a challenge.
All of them losing their deposit, except the victor there. It was the safest Labour seat in Wales, it still is.
So, with those results under our belt, I think Bob Mackenzie has some news.
Well, something very interesting happened in the total vote now. The Conservatives have actually outpaced Labour by, what, 50,000, 60,000? And that's a new development. They're bound to be able to make something of it, claiming that we got more votes if it's a near-dead heat in the House of Commons. The Liberals are still running at half the vote of either of the big parties, with still only 8 seats to show for it. It's really a rather spectacular chart, that one, when you now look at it. Could we also look at the share of the vote, because this follows from the first one. The Conservative share of the vote in this election, in the centre column at the top, is now slightly ahead of the Labour share of the vote. The Tories are down 7.5% from the last election. Labour's down just over 5.5% from the last election. And the only winners in share of the vote are the Liberals and the others. Both major parties have lost support in the country, the Conservatives rather more than Labour. But the Conservatives having slightly more support at the moment in 558 seats than has the Labour Party. But the Labour Party is ahead by perhaps 7 seats on our prediction at the moment. We shouldn't go up too absolutely hard now on the possibility that the Conservatives, if they had 8 or 9 loyalists who they could make a deal with, and or the Liberals, could still carry on.
I think it's a very nice question, though, Bob, whether Mr Heath could make a deal with the Loyalists. After all, he's the one that wound up the Stormont government. He put the Assembly in, and indeed a great deal of faith has been put in him by, say, people like Mr Gerry Fitt in coming into government in Northern Ireland. So a deal with the Loyalists would be very hard for him, and indeed very hard indeed for Mr Wilson.
For anybody. I mean, it's just sort of an open issue in one sense. I think myself the most likely thing is a Labour minority government, but I think we shouldn't say there is no possibility of a Conservative minority government the way things are going in these uncertain marginal areas like Northern Ireland.
Well, of course, if you run something like a presidential election campaign, you get a presidential election result, you have the surplus of the votes, but you don't actually have the seats. No. A little look at the Belfast West result there. Mr Gerry Fitt, who's the deputy head of the executive under Mr Brian Faulkner.
That's a bigger majority than they used to have in Belfast West, but I think it's probably rather a disappointment for Mr Fitt, who expected rather more.
We'd better have a word from Belfast about these matters now. Vincent Hanna is there, so let's go to Belfast and hear from him.
Well, from Northern Ireland, there is sensational news. The Loyalists, those are the people who support the Reverend Ian Paisley, have captured 2 important Belfast seats with massive swings. 15.6% in one case, 21.4% in another. And this is a very serious situation here, because these are the people who say, and they confirmed it this morning to me, that they will disrupt the democratic process in Westminster, that they will act in a balance of power situation. But there is good news for supporters of Mr. Gerard Fitt, because he has once again won West Belfast in the face of intense opposition from Republican candidates. He has beaten John McQuaid with a majority of just over 2,000. A quick comment from our expert, Dr. Con O'Leary.
The swing to which you refer is the swing from the Assembly elections last year. It's been very high in those 2 constituencies. Mr. Fitt's result can be regarded as quite exceptional. If this swing were to be repeated elsewhere in Northern Ireland, it could mean that the Loyalists would win all the remaining seats.
And that would be very serious for whoever occupies number 10 Downing Street. Now, with me is the Minister of Commerce for Northern Ireland and the Deputy Leader of the SDLP party, Mr. John Hume. Comment, please.
Well, delighted at Gerry Fitt's return. He faced fierce and intense opposition in one of the most vitriolic campaigns that we've ever seen, and he has come through yet again. He has upped our vote of 6 months ago by 6,000 votes, showing that his clear support in the non-unionist camp for Sunningdale. I reject the interpretation of the swing to Loyalists based on Assembly elections. That's an improper swing because the issues were different. And I would also point out that in each case where a Loyalist has won a seat, he has won it on a minority vote.
At the same time, there's a very serious and significant swing to the Loyalist faction.
Well, I accept that they've won 2 seats in Belfast.
But 2 safe seats.
Two traditional Loyalist seats in Belfast, but when one looks at the vote, one can see, and the interesting thing in terms of Sunningdale that has to be looked at in this election is the areas in which there is a clear choice between the 2 brands of Unionists. Well, and to date, there is clear evidence that there is strong support.
We have to stop you here because we have to go back now to Network and back to London. We'll be back in Northern Ireland again soon. So I return you to London.
And we just pause briefly in London before going out to Chelmsford, where Esther Ranson is talking to Mr. Norman St. John Stevens.
First of all, obviously, Norman St. John Stevens, I must congratulate you on your...
Thank you, Esther, very much.
But looking ahead, although you are, of course, still officially Minister for the Arts, it looks likely that you may have to give up that.
Well, I think we must wait for the result. I'm officially and unofficially still Minister for the Arts.
Very good. But if you were to lose it, what would you miss most about it, do you think?
I think what I would miss most is really having a job into which, even in the short time I've been in it, I've been able really to put the whole of myself. There are very few jobs, you know, like that. And I mean, if you can't be Prime Minister, the next best thing to be is to be Minister for the Arts. And I'm very sorry I've been unable to get through, so far, the public lending right for authors, for justice to authors. But at any rate, whether I continue to be Minister or not, at least I've given it a jolly good push.
Did you find that you learned anything new in your job? Did it broaden your horizons, so to speak, at all?
Yes, I think that what I knew, as it were, in an abstract way, I realized in a very concrete way how terribly important the arts are in our society, and at a time when, of necessity, because of the crisis, we have to spend less on our material objectives, we can, I think, very profitably spend a great deal more on our spiritual ones, and in gaining those objectives, I put the arts very high indeed.
So people who say we can't afford them, give them up, you say not
we can't
at all,
afford not to have the arts, and any money spent on the arts, you get an immense return, and in comparison with other spheres of public expenditure, there are very small sums involved indeed. So my slogan was and is, spend more on the arts and help to give the country the artistic values which people want, particularly for their children.
That's a very long slogan.
Yes,
Do you think
I know.
It'll catch on?
I don't know. If you repeat it often enough when you're interviewing all my various rivals, and I think it will.
You seem to have a sense of humour, Norman.
Yes, I've needed it just recently.
Isn't that against the rules for a politician?
I think really having a sense of humour is the same thing as having a sense of proportion.
But I thought that once a politician got people to laugh, they lost votes.
Well, that hasn't been the case in Chelmsford, and we have had one or two good laughs, yeah.
What's your ambition now?
My ambition is to continue to serve the country in Parliament, to serve my constituents here, and to serve the Conservative Party, which I've been a member of for over 20 years.
Norman St. John Stevens, thank you very much indeed. Back to London.
Thank you.
And let's have a look at what the prediction board is saying at this particular time. And let's just have a quick look here and see. Conservatives 297, Labour 306, Liberals 13. The Labour majority over the Conservatives 9 after 559 results. And that, of course, is still clearly in injury time. Well, there are many serious issues, of course, in this election, and there are many serious issues to be faced by the country in the hours and days ahead. But all general elections aren't just like that. It has its moments of fun and its unusual stories. Robin Day now is talking to the cartoonist Jack.
Well, amid all the gloom and depression and doubt and confusion, something rather interesting has been happening and rather funny. David Butler may have problems with his computer, and Robert Mackenzie may have problems with a swingometer, but it's nothing to the problems Jack has had with his cartoons. Now, tell us the story, Jack. That was, when did you do that one?
Well, I tried to cover my bets the day before the election by doing three versions.
Yes.
First of all the pollsters and everybody at the paper thought that Heath would win.
Yes.
So I did a sort of Smiling Ted with the caption of winner by a firm but fair knockout.
I noticed the referee, you've got a very good likeness of Alistair Burnett there.
But just to cover my bets,
yes.
I also had Harold Wilson winning, just
yes.
in case.
Yes,
there was
yes.
the outside chance.
Yes, Robert Carville said no chance at all, I suppose.
Yes. Unfortunately, this is the one that's had to go in the paper today with a revised caption.
Yes,
careful,
I have it here, yes.
You know, careful, Harold, the real fight's just beginning.
Yes.
But this is only a temporary one.
Yes.
On the other hand, at the time, I felt that there was a possibility that Jeremy Thorpe would hold a sort of a massive Liberal minority.
Yes.
So I had to put him in with a big fight shock. However, during the night, listening to my radio and that, I was aware I'd have to go to work again.
Yes.
So I've come in, and later on tonight, the paper will change, or the cartoon will change, and I've got them all out, and a favourite caption came, you know, the oldest one in the world, "We can't go on meeting like this."
Well, the laughter is its own congratulations, Jack. That's your final version.
That's it. No more.
Well, there we are. Alistair Burnett is looking puzzled there.
Well, I'm very glad to say that the responsibility of running the country isn't actually in my hands.
And they are going to go on meeting like that if these results mean anything.
And we'll be meeting them for a long time to come. There's Michael Foot back there in Ebbw Vale. Of course, again, it would be a real earthquake if he hadn't got back, but I shouldn't say that. There were, in fact, 2 minor earthquakes in South Wales, geographically or geologically, earlier this week. Conservatives holding mid-Sussex, well, would have been a real earthquake if they had lost it. Let's look at some of these results. And here's mid-Sussex, Mr. Timothy Renton holding the seat.
Liberals with 30%, up into second place, up 10%.
And in Petersfield, Miss Joan Quennell back.
Liberals up into second place, up 20% to 35% of the vote. Miss Quennell comfortably back.
And Kettering, Sir Geoffrey de Freitas. Of course, when he left Lincoln, Mr. Dick Taverne took that seat, and so another saga began, but of course he's been back in Kettering since 1964.
Very slight swing to Labour in this Steel seat.
And in East Grinstead, the burghers there, loyally returning Mr. Geoffrey Johnson-Smith.
Liberals still in second place and up to 34%.
And we'll have some more results in a moment, but that is the way, and we have some quite crucial and key results still to come, and very crucial and key talks going on in several parts of London. Now, this is a time perhaps to lift our eyes from the election exclusively, and let's go now to the newsroom where Kenneth Kendall will give us the news.
Hello. Well, another cold afternoon for most of us, very cold in some eastern areas. If you look on the chart, you'll see there's outbreaks of rain, sleet and snow down many eastern parts of the country, from northeast Scotland down to Kent. As the afternoon goes on, though, this rain, sleet and snow will move away eastwards. And somewhat brighter and drier weather will come along from the west, though it'll probably be after dark before this drier weather finally reaches the northeast of England. In the brighter weather in the west, there'll be sunny spells. There'll also be showers, these showers falling as snow over the higher ground. And then tonight, well, it'll become mostly dry, apart from a few showers near western coasts. But it's going to be a cold night with a fairly widespread moderate frost in most places. And possibly also in southeastern districts, a few mist and fog.
Labour Party and a cap.
Well, that's all from me, and now back to Alistair.
And that does sound very much like a political forecast, mist and fog patches and snow on the higher ground. While we were away there, we've had a few headlines, and the Scottish Nationalists have taken Aberdeenshire East. That is Mr. Douglas Henderson, the former senior vice chairman of the party, and he has defeated Mr. Patrick Walridge-Gordon, who had been the MP there since 1958.
A very big majority, and the Scottish Nationalists have their 4th seat. I think they're almost bound to have the Western Isles, that's 5 seats, and they've got good hopes in Argyll, so we might well have 6 Scottish Nationalists.
Now, here's some news for the Conservatives. Our understanding is that they have held Buckingham. That I don't know if it's official yet, but our belief is that Mr. Bill Benyon has held Buckingham.
With an increased majority.
And there it is official, Mr. Robert Maxwell failing to return to Parliament. And there is a recount going on at Berwick-on-Tweed. The Liberals have held one of their by-election successes, the Isle of Ely. They've lost Ripon and Sutton and Cheam, and now a recount going on at Berwick. There,
they had 2 recounts in the by-election last November.
Well, it was very narrow.
Majority of 57.
I think we'll have a little look now at Belfast North. And here again, a United Unionist Party candidate is back in Belfast North. This was the seat which was once held by Mr. Stratton Mills. He didn't contest it this time. Mr. David Smith has not even really challenged.
But once again, a pro-Unionist, pro-Sunningdale majority, but a comfortable win for the Loyalists through the split vote.
But unable to muster it on the part of one pro-Assembly party. And I think now Robin Day is talking to Gerry Fitt in Belfast.
Good morning, Mr. Fitt.
Good morning, Robin.
Can Mr. Wilson rely on your support in the House of Commons if he forms a minority government?
Mr. Wilson could always rely on my support.
So we can call it 307 instead of 306
It's a 307. I hope it's more before the
turning to the Ulster picture, you'll forgive me starting with the national one first. Turning to the Ulster picture, what is going to be the reading we should have of your results over there with 3 we have Mr. Craig in at Belfast East, the Reverend Bradford, not Mr. Roy Bradford, in another loyalist in Belfast South, and Mr. Carson in another constituency just now.
Naturally, I would have wanted to see other results, but the votes have been cast and those people have been elected by their constituencies. In my own contest, I have just emerged from one of the dirtiest smear campaigns that I have ever been engaged in. I was opposed by a United Ulster Loyalist, and I can quite understand his opposition. I have been opposed to him throughout my life. But on the other side, we had Mr. Price, who ran as an independent candidate. He is the father of the Price sisters, and one has only got to look at the press since polling day to see that every vicious tactic imaginable was used against me in this election. Another candidate, Republican clubs, he again used a very dirty campaign, but they haven't been successful.
Do you tell the people of Northern Ireland, and did you tell them in your campaign, that if there is a Labour government and a Labour Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that it will pursue broadly the same policies and will not sell out the north to the south?
Yes, I have said that repeatedly, that there has been a bipartisan approach to the Northern Ireland problem existing at Westminster. I know that Conservative ministers, in their own way, they have tried to be helpful. But I'm very much looking forward, and I don't want to be making appointments to Mr. Wilson's cabinet. I'm very much looking forward to Merlin Rees taking over as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
Mr. Fitt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
There are some words coming through now about some Conservative successes. It appears that they may well have held Falmouth and Camborne and Bosworth, and that of course would mean there's a recount there at Hertford and Stevenage, which is interesting. But of course, if these hold up, it would mean that Mr. Wilson's majority is by no means secure, and we really are in the deadlock position.
Hertford and Stevenage is surely Shirley Williams' seat, which we thought was firmly in her hands. The Conservatives have failed to catch any of the 4 seats we said they could get. The Labour Party has failed to get any of the 4 seats we expected on the swing that they might likely get. So the picture is not quite so good for the... in fact, the projection has gone down to 305 for Labour now.
Well, with that situation, this is the time, I think, to go to Keith Graves there at Transport House.
Well, until a few minutes ago, the foyer here at Transport House was crowded with Labour Party workers who were hoping that Mr Wilson would come here straight from the airport. They were going to give him a jubilant reception, but he presumably thought that the jubilation was a little premature. He went straight to his house, as you probably saw, about 200 yards away. We have just heard, however, that he is going to come here in about 10 to 20 minutes' time. At the moment, he is having lunch with some of his aides and with Mrs Wilson, and also with Ron Haywood, the Labour Party's General Secretary. Then he is going to come here and talk to the Labour Party workers who've helped him throughout the campaign, and then he's going for a very important shadow cabinet meeting. Mr Callaghan's on his way down at the moment. He says that that meeting will be held at the House of Commons, and it could take, he says, several hours. He'll be getting results into him there, and we hope that he may be able to talk to us, probably throwing a bit more light on his future after that meeting. This is Keith Graves at Transport House.
And at the close of Keith Graves' remarks there, we saw how Mr James Sillars has held Ayrshire South, a safe mining seat and as well as farming seat in South Ayrshire. A look at the prediction board now after some of these results have been coming in. And that shows how the gap has narrowed and how we are very much in a deadlock situation, looking all the time more like a minority government. And that's what the computer is telling us. We'll have a little look now at some of the results which have come through, and in some of the home counties and a little bit to the west. All quite safe Conservative situations. Airy Neave back in Abingdon.
Hardly any change there, and yet in all those seats the Liberals jump up from lost deposits to a quarter of the vote. It doesn't affect the share of the other two parties.
And some more reasonably safe Conservative seats. Yarmouth safe there for Mr Anthony Fell. He has been in some trouble there in the past.
Hardly any move in those East Anglian seats. We're waiting for Norfolk North West, which the Conservatives might pick up from Labour.
And here's some famous names. Michael Foot, Francis Pym, who's been the Secretary of Northern Ireland, and Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, all back.
With very big majorities.
And some quite good news for Labour coming. Shirley Williams, we understand, has held that Stevenage seat. But here we are, some more Conservative seats racking up now from the counties, from Cornwall up to Angus.
I do wonder about that recount in Bodmin, which we were told about a long, long while ago. We've heard nothing from Bodmin since then.
Well, that'll be coming in, I don't doubt, in due course. Perhaps they've broken for lunch. It'd be very sensible of them if they did. It can be a very long count sometimes. Robert.
Well, the total vote situation gets more and more interesting. You see now the Conservatives are polling roughly 200,000 more votes than Labour, and we think that on present evidence they'll continue to poll more votes than Labour right to the end of the day. But what's really fascinating is the Liberal vote at 400,000 is the largest vote the Liberal Party has ever obtained in the history of the party. Now, we've checked this back to 1929, for example, their previous high, 5,300,000. And the trick is, of course, that in the great days of the Liberal government of 1906, they had nothing like that vote because women didn't have a vote and men, only 60% of men voted. So that Liberal Party figure, is well worth noting, is the largest vote the Liberal Party has obtained in the history of the party.
Where has it got them?
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier, representation. It's got them 8 seats. And it takes a clear 800,000 now to win a Liberal seat.
An interesting result there while we were talking, the Conservatives holding Aberdeenshire West. This was the seat, of course, of Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell and Mr Russell Fairgrieve, who moved up at the last minute from the Borders. He was unsuccessful against Mr David Steele there in 1970. Mr Russell Fairgrieve has held that seat in Aberdeenshire West for the Conservatives. Remember, we told you that Aberdeenshire East has gone to the Scottish Nationalists. A little look now, if we have the opportunity, at some results. And I'd no surprises there.
Okay.
And Jock Bruce Gardine, that was an outside chance, I think, for some of his rivals, but he's safely back.
The Liberals were worrying Sir Harwood Harrison, but they're still 14% behind him in I.
Commodore of the House of Commons Yacht Club. Here's Falmouth and Campbell, Mr David Mudd holding that seat for the Conservatives. He won it in 1970. And there's Mr Adam Butler holding Bosworth, and Mr Maurice Macmillan, the former Employment Secretary, he's been at the Treasury most recently, holding Farnham.
Bosworth was one of Labour's hopes. There was a slight swing to the Conservatives in this mining seat, or seat with some miners in it.
And these are reasonably safe seats coming through for the parties there, although the Conservatives obviously bucked, I suppose, by Falmouth and Campbell and by Bosworth. And now Robin.
Well, coming back to the problems of the new government, Alf Allen of Usdaw distinguished member of the trade union delegation, which has been talking with Mr. Heath off and on. Mr. Allen, what do you say that the trade unions can do to help a minority Labour government in this difficult situation, and in particular, is the TUC's offer not to use an increase for the miners as an argument for their own claims still on the table, available to Harold Wilson?
Well, firstly, today I have to say that clearly I'm disappointed that the Labour Party have not secured an overall victory over the other two parties. I'm left, because of that, facing, as I see it, a challenging and critical situation. But one thing I think is certain, that the trade union movement, given a leadership of Mr. Wilson and his government, creating the right kind of economic and social conditions that have been clearly indicated to us, given the return of a Labour government, that the trade union movement will respond in a responsible manner.
Can I ask you one question, which you may not want to answer, but your answer would be very interesting if you cared to give it. Who do you think would be the best man to be Chancellor in a Labour government in this situation of perhaps lack of confidence abroad? Do you think you want a man of experience like Mr. Jenkins, or perhaps Mr. Healey, as most people expect?
Well, it's really not for me to comment about that. The plain fact is that
you're a free citizen, Mr. Allen.
Yes, I know, and I opt for the rights of a free citizen. And that is to say that the trade union movement will work with any cabinet minister which Mr. Wilson determines is advisable in the best interests of this country and the party.
Is the trade union offer, TUC offer I mentioned, still on the table to Mr. Wilson?
The offer, it's more than an offer in the sense in which we've had talks with the shadow cabinet as they were then. And certainly I believe that the essential thing is to get Britain back to work. And I'm quite convinced that the trade union movement would take every possible step to ensure that that takes place with all speed.
Do you think that statutory controls must be swept away immediately in this situation?
Oh, of course I do. The history points quite clearly to the fiasco of statutory controls in Britain.
Well, we'll see what the new Labour government, if there is one, a minority Labour government, does. Thank you, Mr. Allen.
Thank you.
Alistair?
And this is a chance to look at those close colleagues of Mr. Wilson's who have been returned in this election. No distinguished heads have rolled this time. Mr. Wilson himself back, Mr. James Callaghan, Mr. Anthony Crossland, Michael Foot, Roy Hattersley, Dennis Healey, Roy Jenkins, Robert Mellish, Fred Peart, Reg Prentice. These are all names of the last Labour government. Merlin Rees, who might pick Northern Ireland. William Ross, it's not quite clear whether he would go on in Scotland. Peter Shaw, of course, with Europe. These are all the great names of the Conservative Party back. Indeed, Labour Party back. One has, of course, got to say that all the great names of the Conservative Party are back so far, with the exception of Mr. Gordon Campbell in Murray and Nairn, the former, now we must call him, Secretary of State for Scotland. A little look at some of the results. And there are 3 Labour seats.
And 2 of them showing big swing, 2 in Wales, showing big swings to the Conservatives, right against the tide. Then the whole of Wales has, on balance, swung to the Conservatives and not to Labour.
And the most marginal one there is the bottom one, Leon Britton taking Cleveland and Whitby.
And there's a mining seat with a low swing to Labour.
And 2 mining seats and a farming seat.
And 2 mining seats, both swinging to the Conservatives. And a farming seat also swinging. 3 seats, all showing a movement against the national tide towards the Conservatives.
And here we have no particular surprises in any of those. And Derbyshire North East, this is Mr. Tom Swain, there's mining in that as well.
I think there may be something wrong about that swing figure. I think it might be checked. If it is, it's a very remarkable result.
And here we have some more seats. No surprises there, but the waistcoats of Mr. Leo Abse will not be absent from the new House of Commons.
And there's no reason for the scare about a recount in Harford and Stevenage. It was absolutely clear-cut Labour over Conservative by a handsome 8,000 majority.
Now, David, what has the Labour Party got to look forward to if it's going to widen this gap now? It's down to a Labour majority over Conservative of only 7.
Frankly, it has nothing to look forward to except saving Colne Valley from the assault of Richard Wainwright, which is one of the Liberals' best hope almost now. There are recounts going in Bodmin and Berwick, 2 seats the Liberals hoped, one they hope to hold, one they hope to win. And there's also, of course, the recount we've heard about in Carmarthen, where on the 3rd recount it was rumoured that Gwynfor Evans, the president of the Plaid Cymru, was ahead by 10 votes.
But none of these 3 recounts really affects Mr Wilson's predicament, because these are none of them seats which will go to Labour. They merely
Carmarthen is held by Labour.
Sorry. So there's at least one thing for Mr Wilson to keep his fingers crossed about. The others, fights between Conservatives and Liberals. And, of course, we still haven't heard yet from some of the seats that the Scottish Nationalists hope to take. Now, Robin.
Well, 3 well-informed political journalists are joining me now to speculate on the new situation, which we will assume for the purposes of argument is a minority Labour government under Mr Wilson. How will this affect his cabinet, and do you think that his cabinet, particularly the key office of Chancellor, will be affected by the situation in which he finds himself? Alan Watkins.
Yes, Chancellor is the key job, really. It's much more important than Foreign Secretary. In some ways, you could argue that Denis Healey would be a reliable choice, because he's a rather stern fellow and seems set to inaugurate a regime of Cromwellian austerity which might please the foreign bankers. On the other hand, he has not had experience, whereas Roy Jenkins has. Now, Roy Jenkins, it's very well known, wants to be Foreign Secretary, though I don't think he'd say no to going back...
to renegotiate the Treaty of Rome?
I think that would be farmed out to somebody else, you know.
See. Yeah.
I think there'd be someone like Peter Shaw, or we've had this rather lunatic speculation that Enoch Powell might be offered the job. I don't think that's odd by itself. But Roy Jenkins would like the perks of being Foreign Secretary, to be another great office of state for him to have held. You have this dilemma in Wilson's mind.
Is Mr Crosland a possibility?
I think Mr Crosland's a possibility. The other possibility, of course, is Mr Harold Lever, who would certainly command respect of a sort in international financial circles, except that he has what are considered various dotty ideas, such as he believes in growth and not punishing people and not creating unemployment deliberately, and in the present economic climate these would be rather unfashionable.
Ian Waller, what do you think about it?
Well, I think Mr Healey is the most likely choice for it, because it's not only, as Alan rightly says, the most important job, it's also the most urgent job, because there has to be a budget within a month. And there has to be probably negotiations with foreign bankers for a massive loan to cover our balance of payments deficit. So therefore, as Denis Healey has been preparing the ground as Shadow Chancellor, I would guess that he will continue in that way, with Roy Jenkins as Chancellor, as Foreign Secretary.
Comment, Andrew Alexander?
Well, I would think that, as a matter of fact, Crossland is an outsider to go for in this particular situation. When Roy Jenkins was made Chancellor in place of Mr Callaghan, in fact, it was thought, on very good grounds, that Mr Wilson, in fact, at first had thought that he would prefer Anthony Crossland. I think he's a very likely figure. It is such a key figure because it's that face just going through number 11 Downing Street, which will have the whole effect on the external currency markets.
Well, we'll perhaps see a little of Westminster and Mr Wilson shortly.
We are waiting now for the result from Barry, where Sir Raymond Gower is the defending Conservative candidate. We'll have a little look at some results if we have a moment. There's the one for 3 for the Conservatives there.
But the Aberdeenshire West is the interesting one. The Liberals came fairly near to taking that seat. They held from 66 to 70. They were, though, 3% behind the Conservatives. Mr Fairgrieve gets the seat that Mad Mitch had.
And Mr Corrie Farmer taking Fitzroy MacLean's old seat. And here's the Hemel Hempstead result. Mr James Allison back there, but very narrow indeed.
It had to be a recount, a 4% swing to Labour. That's the sort of seat Labour need to make an unexpected breakthrough if they were to do anything today. It has been very disappointing. I think they've only made 3 gains in today's results when they needed about 8.
And Durham Northwest, well, nobody's going to make a breakthrough there.
The Liberals come in and get 18% in a Durham seat.
And here's Daventry, no real surprises there, Liberal running quite strongly.
Used to be called South Northamptonshire.
And that's the best that we can do at this moment to comfort Mr. Wilson, but I think he must know now very well what his fate is over the next few hours.
Look behind your head, Alistair. It really is very striking to see that the Conservatives within 10 seats of Labour. They were way behind. Now, in the last body of results, they've come so that it's not just a computer projection. These actual seats, we have solid evidence these have been won and lost.
Now, and again, of course, as Bob Mackenzie and you have been saying, David, this is a situation where the Conservatives have a majority of votes cast over Labour. Now, one wonders how that's going to temper the conduct of the House of Commons. Such a minority government, even if it has only unofficial Liberal support, how is it going to say that it has a mandate to do anything?
I think this is a great dilemma. I really find this a very depressing result.
This is one that will, of course, can't be resolved until Parliament meets, but it must be a worry at the back of Mr. Wilson's head as he has his lunch now. I think this is a chance to go over there to Barry to see what the result is likely to be and what the situation is at this moment.
Well, we're expecting the result here at any moment. The candidates are assembled on the platform. We're just waiting for the returning officer. It's a four-sided contest. Labour, Conservative, Plaid Cymru and the Liberals, and it's held by Sir Raymond Gower for the Conservatives since 1951. The results should be with us in just a minute or so.
If I can just interrupt there, we could give the news while we're waiting at Barry that the Liberals have recaptured the Colne Valley. So that's Richard Wainwright back in the seat which he had from 66 to 70, and Mr. David Clark out. So that's a success for Jeremy Thorpe today.
And a Labour seat lost. It's a Liberal victory at the expense of Labour. Most of the Liberal things are at the expense of the Conservatives.
So it all becomes curiouser and more deadlock. A little chance to take in some results if we can. Here's Ilkeston. Very
swing to the Conservatives, a big swing to the Conservatives, 3.8, about the biggest I remember.
Only had one result there at that time. Well, now that's Richard Wainwright back. That's quite a reinforcement to Mr. Thorpe's benches. He must now, I suppose, be most concerned about the David Steele result.
David Steele, of course, he assumes that Joe Grimmond will be back, and there's Russell Johnston in Inverness, and then there are those two recounts in Bodmin and Berwick. And, of course, there's Ross and Cromarty, where they have some hope of a breakthrough. So they could get up to 14, but they'll be very lucky if they all go their way.
But Richard Wainwright, in his way, perhaps the personification of moderation. And he's fought that seat through thick and thin, by-elections, general elections. It's always nip and tuck, and he's remade it Liberal territory in this general election. Nothing coming in now to help the Conservatives to say that they're holding any of their difficult seats. They must still have hopes in Berwick-on-Tweed, of course, there with that recount. We'll have a word now with Paul Griffiths in that Conservative stronghold, the City. And here's Paul's report on the mood and the comment there now.
Well, the City of London has had its long face and its rather glum face all morning, and it still has it at this stage of the day. But what about the small investor? I wonder whether the small investor is actually, and should be, as confused as perhaps the rest of the country is. Charles Woodhouse, you're Managing Director of Hill Samuel Unit Trusts. How do you feel with the predictions, the confusion of the predictions at the moment? How do you feel on behalf of the private investor? What should or could he be doing?
Well, as far as a unit holder is concerned, I think they should stand fast. There's no cause for panic. They've got professional money managers looking after their interests here in the city, and that's all they need.
But those people who aren't under your wing, as it were, or under the wing of unit trusts or bonds of some description, and are going it alone, how should they feel at the moment?
Oh, I think life is much more difficult for them. It always has been. Of course, the professional manager has seen this up and down in the market before. It's very confusing indeed for the private individual. But I think nowadays there are enough methods of employing a manager from unit trusts in all sorts of other ways that they should really think seriously about taking this step and employing one.
Do you think that the city is looking for another election if it comes out the way it looks as though it might?
I think the city is always disappointed in a period of uncertainty. I don't think that it's up to the city, and I don't think it can, in fact, influence as to whether there's going to be an election or not.
But how badly off will the city be if, in fact, the Labour Party gets in with a very slim majority? as it looks as though it might at this time, how badly off will the city be? Because this morning we've seen even the headlines of the evening papers are saying worst day ever, this sort of thing.
Oh, I think this is a reaction to the market which crept up before the poll in line with the opinion polls in the country, and all it has done today is to fall back to its previous level.
And Mr. Heath is holding a press conference at 3 o'clock, obviously a vital moment for him and for the country. And with that situation at 2 o'clock, the Conservatives just 10 seats behind Labour at this time, and Liberals and others with 20 seats holding the balance. As I was saying, Mr. Heath with a press conference at 3 o'clock, where no doubt he will make his intentions known. Just one brief footnote, you may have seen the Conservatives holding Norfolk South. That's another of Mr. Heath's young men, Mr. John McGregor, who's been his private secretary, into the House of Commons. So the young Heath men are doing well, even if Mr. Heath himself appears to be on the way out in this general election. However, he's talking at 3 o'clock. A little look at that Liberal gain in the Lacone Valley. There's Richard Wainwright back, and Mr. David Clark, who had the seat for Labour since 1970. He's out this time.
Mr. Wainwright's only up 2%, torn equally from the other two parties. It's enough to put him back in the House again. It's the first three-figure majority. All the other 8 Liberals have had big majorities, 4 figures, up to 11,000 for Jeremy Thorpe in North Devon.
And with the situation in Newark, that Labour have held that seat. Had there been any movement to the Conservatives, it would have been marginal, but that's one Mr. Wilson has got back. He didn't really have any worries about it. Let's go to Robert Mackenzie.
Well, in the southeast, almost all the results are in now, some 64 out of 68. The last one that might have been really close, Buckingham has gone Conservative and Robert Maxwell has lost out. And we've heard that Shirley Williams is back at Hertford and Stevenage. And the only 4 remaining are Saffron Walden, Braintree, Malden and Canterbury, and all of them expected to be safe Conservative wins. On the whole, a rather surprising lack of change when you think of it. Only 2 Conservative losses and therefore 2 Labour gains, Gravesend and Luton East. Perhaps surprising that the Liberals, granted they've doubled their share of the vote in this area, have not been able to pick up anything, even in areas adjoining London where one thought they might do extremely well. Again, the story of a powerful Liberal vote, but not paying off in seats. The ones we watched at the beginning of the evening last night, which might be at risk, well, Labour held all theirs at risk down here, and the 2% swing, give or take a bit, toward the Labour Party gave Labour one gain, the important gain at Gravesend, and another at Luton East. But they didn't manage to cut through in Dover, Oxford and Buckingham the way they might have hoped to do on the way things began last night. When we come to London, it's all in now. Result is 50 Labour seats, up 4, 42 Conservative seats, down 4. And no Liberals again. Liberals losing their one real hope of holding Sutton and Cheam, and no breakthrough at places like Richmond, where they had every reason to think they might do very well. The 4 Labour gains, Ealing North, Battersea South, Lewisham West, Ilford South. Not a great change, and considering the national picture, perhaps about par for the course. Voting in London is well below the level of the nation, but considerably higher turnout than at the last election in 1970. And looking again at the marginals we followed with interest all the time, Labour held all theirs at risk to any kind of Conservative swing down here, and Conservatives surprisingly held several that were at risk to the kind of swing that's actually occurred. Again, this crisscross pattern we've had in many of these closely fought seats. Labour gain at Lewisham West, Ealing North, Ilford, Battersea South. A picture then of major stability in the southeast, with just a shift to the Labour Party, enough perhaps to contribute to that national lead over the Conservatives that they might still reasonably expect to hold. Alistair.
And of course, a picture Bob is painting there is totally different from what the opinion polls were saying locally about the southeast of England. We're now in Smith Square, which of course is where the Conservatives and Labour parties have their central offices at Transport House and Conservative Central Office. And here we have Mr. Wilson coming through with Mr. Hayward, who's the General Secretary of the Labour Party, a throng of admirers. He's coming obviously to Transport House to say his thanks to all the workers there, holding his hand up in triumph, or near triumph, I suppose one has to say. Clearly he's now the chief candidate for the next occupant of number 10 Downing Street. What remains to be seen are the precise terms on which he expects to go there. pausing to have his photograph taken. Lost the picture just for a moment there. Mr. Wilson making his way towards Transport House. And there's no question, but the photographers follow the winner at this particular moment in the election. There goes Mr. Wilson inside, a cheer for him, and all the lights, all the marks of a man coming back to power, even if it's only minority power. And in the middle of the throng there at Transport House, Mr. Wilson, who looks as though the lights have gone out there for a moment. No, we're back on again. And Mr. Wilson, I think, may have something to say. Let's listen.
Thank you for that wonderful welcome. I'm just going to run through. We've got a shadow cabinet. After that, I want to tour the building and thank you all for all you've done. There you are.
Are you holding the cabinet meeting here, Mr. Wilson? Yes. You are here now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, there's Mr. Wilson, and he must remember perhaps the scenes 10 years ago, but here's a little bit of bad news for him and good news for the Conservatives. We understand that Norfolk North West has been held by the Conservative, Mr. Christopher Brocklebank Fowler.
And there's one other seat they've got to worry about, West Gloucestershire. We haven't heard from it, and on the swing in marginal mining seats, it might well go to the Conservatives, having been Labour since 1945.
Well, Mr. Wilson, his plans then, as he said, to have a meeting of his close colleagues who he would hope to form a cabinet with, no doubt, at Transport House. That's at 2:30, I understand. And at 3 o'clock, Mr. Heath has his press conference to announce, I imagine, his intentions. The Liberals are holding a press conference now. Let's go there. And here we have the familiar television apparatus, which the Liberals have installed, of course, for Mr. Thorpe to campaign nationally from his seat at North Devon. Apparently they haven't actually begun there, and we'll have a look at that. There's Sir David Renton back in Huntingdonshire. Of course, it would be a very great surprise if the Conservatives didn't hold that. So we'll have a look at what the computer is predicting at this particular time as the parties gather their thoughts. And this is how a computer sees the result of the election. Labour 304, Conservative 299, Liberal 12, Nationalist 7, others 13. And there we have the computer projection, which Mr. Wilson, Mr. Heath, Mr. Thorpe, and indeed the Nationalists, and indeed those results in Northern Ireland, we've yet to hear from the Reverend Ian Paisley, must have very much on their minds. Well now, Graham, that's what the computer's saying. What do you say to it?
Well, the prediction we have there is very much like we've been having before, except that the gap is narrowing. Labour over Conservative is now down to 5 seats. You'll also notice that we've broken up the prediction for other parties so that we're showing the Nationalists separately from the Northern Ireland seats and the Lincoln seat, the independent Labour seat there. The Northern Ireland seats have given us a little bit of trouble in trying to determine how they will come out. And I must make the point we have not allowed that Gerry Fitz says he would take the Labour Party whip in those figures.
And it remains to be seen, however, if one of the Ulster Unionists might in fact help the Conservatives if it came to a vote on meeting the House. That's an area of uncertainty. One other thing I think we should say, are we including Selwyn Lloyd, the Speaker, among the Conservatives, or are we keeping him among others?
He is in the Conservatives.
Oh, I think he should be in some ways thought of as an other, because he's certainly not going to vote. Speakers never go back to party politics.
Although he had to fight his seat, both Labour and Liberal opposed him. Anyway, there we are. Let's go now to the party conference, where the Labour Party held a press conference in Liverpool. Mr. Wilson, of course, was there, because that's where he spent the night. And here's a report this morning.
I, the undersigned, being the acting returning officer for the constituency above mentioned.
That wasn't, in fact, the press conference this morning. Of course, so many things have happened today. We can't just call it always out of the thin air like that. However, we'll try and get it to you. You've heard Mr. Wilson there in Transport House, and I imagine that gave you the mood of things just as well as anything he felt when he got up this morning. And what, of course, men's secret thoughts are at this moment. Mr. Wilson must have wanted to get back to 10 Downing Street. Did he want to get back on these terms. A look at some of the results here. Newark, there's a Labour seat now rather safer than it had been.
Average swing for the East Midlands.
And in Durham, that's a safe Labour seat at all times.
But a massive swing to the Conservatives. The Liberals must have cut into the Labour vote.
Mr. Goodman Irving in Rye.
And a large increase in the Liberal vote, 30%. Mr. Irving got nearly twice as many.
I think we should now join the Liberal Party conference, which is going on at this time. Let's go over there. I think Mr. Thorpe is speaking.
All I really want to say is this, that we have now polled 5,400,000 votes, and by the end of the election it will be higher still, which is the largest vote that the Liberal Party has ever polled in its history. But it looks as if the number of members of Parliament, which at present stands at 9, will go up to, say, 15, which shows that at the present rate it takes 500,000 votes to return one Liberal Member of Parliament, as opposed to 45,000 for a Conservative or a Labour member. And it does show that we do suffer from the most outrageously undemocratic electoral system. And I would really say two things. First, that I think the 5 million Liberals are going to be very angry, the people who voted Liberal, that the system has cheated them of what they voted for. Secondly, I believe that the British people who are basically fair will agree that this is an extremely unfair system, which doesn't even reflect the views of those who have been successful accurately, and that one of the priorities which one has to face is to see that this electoral system is changed. And there's no good saying it's all very complicated and it can't be understood. It is now reintroduced in Northern Ireland, where it is a force for moderation. And I only wish that it had applied for the Westminster elections, because I think we'd have had a more moderate and responsible outturn of members of Parliament had that been adopted. I would merely say to the 5.5 million Liberals that on the basis of a civilised democratic electoral system, we would now have between 100 and 150 members of Parliament. We're going to get that system changed sooner or later. They must hold fast. We have broken through. Naturally, we're disappointed we haven't got more members of Parliament. Of course we are, but that is the system. It is through no fault of Liberals, who have campaigned superbly and have come up with 5.5 million votes plus. We have broken the two-party system. That is perfectly plain. And insofar as we will have an opportunity to exercise some influence next week, I can assure my fellow Liberals, and through them the country, that we will exercise what influence we have in the direction of moderation, in the direction of getting the maximum degree of national unity in this country, and to try and get an agreed package of proposals which can get this country back on the rails into a proper economic solution of our problems. And we approach that new responsibility, I hope, with a sense of responsibility and a sense of humility. But I want to thank people who voted Liberal all over the country. There have been some superb campaigns fought. We are well placed in many constituencies now to move one place up to victory next time. And as far as Liberals are concerned, I want them to keep their organisation ticking over. They can take the weekend off, and they start work again, I hope, on Monday.
Thank you, Jeremy. On the question of electoral reform, although Mr. Heath and Mr. Wilson both said at press conferences on Wednesday that they didn't think that a free vote on Kilbrandon, which of course includes the single transfer.
And let's see what the situation is. That was the Liberal Party conference. Let's go now to Berwick-on-Tweed.
Gordon Johnson Adam.
Labour.
4,326. Alan James Beath.
Liberal.
15,732. I'll say that again. Alan James Beath.
The Liberal.
15,732. John Donald Morrison Hardy.
Conservative.
15,289.
So the Liberal has retained Berwick.
And I declare that the said Alan James Beath has been duly elected to serve as the member for the constituency.
Ladies
Well, there's Mr. Beath, the victor at Berwick. Of course, he won it at the by-election, but it's certainly a Liberal gain compared with the last general election. He even improved his majority, David.
When he got elected, Newcastle University gave him leave of absence. They thought he mightn't be away for very long. He'll now have to resign his lectureship.
All right, well, that's another Liberal holding at a by-election, as Mr. Clement Freud has held in the Isle of Ely,
And
although
Eddie
other
Milne
Liberals have gone.
has defeated Ivor Richard in Blythe.
Well,
this is S.O. Davis
S.O.
over
Davis
again.
all over again, and that just shows that if you are a Labour MP and you have popularity and a record of good service in your seat, you can actually beat the party machine, as S.O. Davis, David was saying, did last time. And now here, Mr. Eddie Milne, who was dropped by the local Labour Party in Blythe, and they took in Mr. Ivor Richard, a very moderate lawyer who came up from Barons Court, where his seat had been redistributed. But Mr. Milne is back, and that's quite a thing in the northeast of England. Mr. Milne had actually said that there might be corruption in local government in northeast England.
But though he'll go into the other column, he certainly would support a Labour government. He's on the whole a left-wing Labour MP.
Well, that's the news then, a little burst of excitement there, and seats quite close together in the northeast, Berwick and indeed in Blythe. Well, now let's go to Belfast, where Vincent Hanna is talking to the leader of the executive, Mr. Brian Faulkner.
Chief Minister, the first set of results seem to indicate a very positive swing to the loyalist, anti-executive, anti-Sunningdale faction.
But of course you seem to be interpreting this election as a referendum on the executive, on the assembly, on the new power-sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland. It's nothing of the sort. If you were taking it that way, then the votes from the seats so far announced show a good majority in favour of candidates who support the present power-sharing arrangements in Northern Ireland. But this wasn't a referendum. If you have a referendum, you must have a clear choice between two things. In these seats, there was a multiplicity of candidates, and certainly, whilst I'm disappointed that candidates who firmly support our policies didn't win the seats, nevertheless, I cannot regard it as a referendum or as any kind of a test of how the people of Northern Ireland view the present arrangements.
It must surely be a fact, though, that the results here will weaken the morale of the people who are supporting power sharing.
I doubt that very much. In fact, I would feel that this will make people even more determined to go ahead. For instance, had our candidates who firmly support this line had a clear run, as I said to you a moment ago, they would obviously have had a victory. Therefore, I think it will encourage people who believe that the arrangements are right to support them with greater vigour.
Well, you seem to be blaming then your colleagues in the SDLP and the Alliance Party.
Well, we all agreed, of course, in the coalition government here that we would put our candidates up if we wish to do so in particular constituencies, because although we're together as a coalition in government, we are still preserving our identities outside of government.
You have always broadly supported the Conservative Party in Britain. What is going to happen now when loyalist MPs go over and
Well, I can't speak for them, you know, what they would want to do. Those of them, like members of the official Unionist party, are, according to the constitution of their party, actually delegates to the Conservative Party, but I can't speak for them. I don't know what they'll do.
But are you going to stomach any renegotiation of the Sunningdale Agreement, any renegotiation of the terms by which you hold power?
The leader of the Conservative Party, the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the Liberal Party have all said that they firmly support the Constitution Act. They supported it by their votes at Westminster last year. They've all said there can't be any renegotiation of that act. I don't believe there can either. And I firmly believe that if people try to do that, then they are weakening our position within the United Kingdom. They are pointing to the day when Northern Ireland can no longer stay in the United Kingdom. And that, to me, would be political tragedy.
Will you be happy to work with a Labour Prime Minister and a Labour Cabinet?
Indeed. It's been my privilege in government over a period of 15 years or so to work with Harold Wilson and George Brown and Ted Heath and Harold Macmillan and Lord Hume, and I've never found any problem in working with Labour Party rather than Conservative Party. I'm quite certain that they will be gentlemen in politics.
Thank you very much, Chief Minister. This is Vincent Hanna in Belfast, and now back to Alistair Burnett in London.
Mr. Brian Faulkner, his head is sometimes bloody, but it's never bowed. Let's have a look at some results. We have some results in train. Here's Blythe. We shouldn't really call this ILP because that has connotations of the past. It merely means that Mr. Edward Milne is taking that seat as an independent.
That is a most impressive result, really. 6,000 majority for a man who's bucked the party machine, denied the party nomination, on grounds of having exposed corruption or other rows in North West. But it really is a big thing.
And here's a good one for the Conservatives, Mr Brocklebank Fowler holding Norfolk North West.
After a narrow margin. Last time it was the nearest and the second narrowest in the election, I think.
And now we come to the Wirral. Here's the Speaker. I think it's rather regrettable that the Speaker was opposed. It's not the normal practice. Mr Lloyd was, and of course he's just held it with a normal Conservative majority.
And I think it's a little misleading to think of him as Conservative, because he really will be an independent, non-party character.
And here's Sir David Renton, a confirmation of that result.
And a good Liberal vote, nearly 30%.
So I imagine that there's a fair amount of celebrating in the Milne family in Blythe. And there it is tonight, and a little bit of chagrin perhaps on the part of those local Labour bosses who got rid of him. Now, what's the computer saying after these results? Here we are, with Conservatives got within 4 of the Labour Party at the moment, and there's still a little time to come. Liberals with 14. We have those 12 seats from Ulster, which it's difficult to call precisely how all the members will vote if it came to a question of organising the House of Commons, though we know and suspect how individuals might go. We have there the combined Scottish and Welsh nationalists, and they may well work as something of a coherent group. They've tried to do so in the past, and 3 others, including the Speaker, Mr Dick Taverne. Now, Graham.
Well, I just wanted to spell out that Milne, Selwyn, Lloyd and Taverne are the 3 others, and that's why those numbers don't add up to 635.
All right, well, it's plenty of the numbers game going on. We just got a little bit of news that, of course, Mr Kilfedder has held down north for the United Ulster Unionists. That's reverse. If you're taking it not in the terms that Mr Brian Faulkner thinks of it, there's the result. Roy Bradford is, of course, one of Mr Faulkner's ministers, and you can't actually add those figures up to say that there is a majority for the Sunningdale Agreement. Now, down north is a strongly Protestant area, just to the east of Belfast, commuter country, quite well-off country. And Mr Kilfedder, he racks up pretty big majorities most times.
But if his vote was going to decide things, he'd probably vote with the party he's been voting for in the lobbies at Westminster for some years now.
Probably he wouldn't actually go with a Labour government on some of the ideas that Labour has expressed about Northern Ireland, or some ministers in the Labour government have said. And now Robin Day, I think, is talking to Rennie Short, who's in Birmingham.
Yes, good afternoon again, Mrs Short. Can you hear me, Mrs Short? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mrs Short? No, Mrs Short can't hear me yet. Hello, Mrs Short. Well, now, just while we're waiting for Mrs Short to get her sound in order, I'll talk to my 3 journalistic colleagues. Ian Waller, how do you see this new situation? Do you think that Jeremy Thorpe is right when he says he's broken the 2-party system?
Well, he's broken it in one sense, in the sense that they've got a large number of votes, but he hasn't broken it in practice in the House of Commons.
Do you think he's got a hope of getting electoral reform?
Not the slightest hope, no. Mark, I think he's absolutely right when he says that there will be a great deal of resentment among the 5 million people who did vote Liberal, and also a feeling in the country of unfairness about the fact that 5 million people are only represented by perhaps a dozen members of Parliament at Westminster.
6 million, nearly
6 million now. Well, it's even worse. I mean, it's a staggering figure. Yes.
Alan Watkins, what do you think about this and the... what are your thoughts since we last talked, and in particular the Liberal achievement?
I think that if you're in business to win seats, and it's no good crying, it's not fair, which is what Jeremy Thorpe is doing. And I think that he's onto a loser here, and the British don't like people who keep whinging and whining, and this is what he's doing. He's had a great success down in the West Country on his personal vote, and good luck to him there. He's worked hard for it, but it is no good at all blaming the system, which is what every tin pot little revolutionary does, saying it's not fair. If you're in business, you should be able to...
If you want to change the system, you've got to say it, haven't you?
Well, no. If you
well, let me ask Mrs. Rennie Short, who can now hear me, do you think Jeremy Thorpe is justified, Mrs. Short, in saying, I've got nearly 6 million votes for my party, yet we've only got 10 seats so far, as against nearly 300 each for the other 2 parties? In other words, he said, you may have heard his press conference, takes 500,000 votes to elect 1 Liberal MP.
Well, I think that this is what the Liberals have been saying since the beginning of time, of course, and
well, the Labour Party said it in 1928 or 9. They introduced a bill for the alternative vote. Do you remember? You probably aren't old enough to remember.
Mr. Day, since then we have managed to build up the party and present our party so that we win support and are able to form governments. And that really is the challenge to the Liberals. They haven't done it this time. In spite of all the ballyhoo and the upsurge of the Liberal vote, you know, and the public opinion polls and the press and all that.
Yes. Now, what do you want what we're calling the shadow cabinet, but of course it isn't the shadow cabinet because there isn't one until the new Parliament assembles. But Mr. Wilson and a group of his senior colleagues, what do you want them to be saying to Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Short?
It will be the cabinet, of course, when the government's formed, not the shadow cabinet.
Yes, indeed.
I want them to say, and I'm sure that this is what they will be saying, that Mr. Wilson must form his government, he must govern, he must carry on governing, and must go to the country in the fairly near future, I would have thought, on a major issue where he can win the support of the country and get a decisive majority.
Now, I want to bring in Andrew Alexander here, who's got some interesting theories on the impact of Mr. Powell's influence in your area, Mrs. Short, and see whether you think he's talking sense or nonsense.
Well, you asked me about that last night, didn't you?
I know. I want to hear what Andrew Alexander, who's rather close to Mr. Powell in philosophy, some ways.
Well, the closeness I'm talking about at the moment is having looked at some of the figures of Wolverhampton itself, and I see that in the boundary readjustment it gained 2 wards in the Tettenhall wards, which were extremely strongly Conservative. It lost 3 wards which were tended to be Labour but not so markedly so, and I understand that in Wolverhampton Conservative Association there were some estimates the majority there should have been something like 20,000.
So what is your conclusion?
Well, if that is so, and the majority in fact was 6,900, then the impact of Mr. Powell there certainly was enormous.
Do you think it was an impact in Mrs. Short's seat?
Well, I'm not sure about North East. I've only looked at the boundary readjustment for South West, and Mrs. Short could tell me if there's any boundary readjustment for North East. I haven't looked at that one.
Oh yes, I had a very considerable boundary review and had 30,000 new electors in my constituency. Yeah. I had 40,000 of the old constituency left and 30,000 new ones, so it was a very considerable change.
Mrs. Short, are you looking forward to a job in the Labour government?
I'd very much like to have a job, yes indeed.
Well, that's a jolly frank answer to give.
Of course, I'm always very frank, Mr. Day.
Most people
Don't you know that?
Most people say that is, of course, a matter for the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, if Harold's any sense, he'll know what to
do. Thank you very much, Mrs. Short.
Well, we should now say that there will not be a Heath press conference at 3 o'clock. Our information about that was inaccurate, and certainly the situation would seem to justify Mr. Heath hanging on for a little while, because the position is that the gap has now narrowed to a Labour lead of only 4 over the Conservatives, and if you take into account some of these Northern Ireland results, and if the Loyalists there were to decide that they didn't like the idea of a Labour government, they felt that it wasn't going to be in their interest in the present situation, then it might be that they might unofficially vote for the Conservatives in organising the House. And that would then perhaps throw the balance into the hands of the nationalist parties. And again, that would mean there are some nationalists who have some left-wing ideas, there are some who have some right-wing ideas. Would their cohesion hold up in this position? And so again, it really is, in many ways, a repetition of the situation in 1964. Sir Alec Douglas-Home stayed on in number 10 till almost the last results. Mr. Heath is doing so again now, and there is no guarantee at the moment that Mr. Wilson really could organise the new House of Commons. We must wait and see. Let's have a look at some of the results. No, we haven't got any. Let's have a little look at these results now. These are Conservative majorities coming in, and these, of course, are all helping Mr. Heath.
A slight swing for Mr. Heath's former private secretary in Norfolk South to the Conservatives, but Basingstoke moving nearer to being a marginal seat.
And some more safe seats there. Leominster, the Conservatives just hang on.
That was the Liberals' best hope. They got 41.7% of the vote. It was the Liberals told me it was their best hope in the West Midlands. Well, it obviously was worth trying. 4.5% behind